Hi, Lawrence Krauss here, and I wanted to append a brief video note to this podcast you're about to hear for a variety of reasons, but one, because the person I'm having the discussion with, Barry Barish, will be one of the guest speakers also on our upcoming Origins Project Foundation trip under the Northern Lights to Greenland, September 8th to 21st, 2022. We'll travel from Reykjavik to Greenland under the Northern Lights, and guest speakers Barry Barish, myself, and Richard Dawkins will be aboard to spend time with the travelers who come along for 14 days, to spend time not just hearing the lectures, but also to interact with us and the other wonderful travelers that we have coming along. We've had a great response, and we have not many berths left, maybe 4 or 5. So I thought I'd invite any of you who are interested to go to our website, originsprojectfoundation.org, and go to the travel button and learn about the trip. $2,000 of the cost of the trip will go as a tax-deductible donation to help support the foundation. So I hope I'll see some of you next September. And right now you can listen to me and Barry Barish talk about some of the things that we'll discuss, just a few of the things that we'll discuss with some of you in Greenland next year. This episode is with an old friend of mine and a famous and remarkable physicist, Barry Barish, who won the Nobel Prize in 2017 along with Kip Thorne and Rainer Weiss for the discovery of gravitational waves, one of the fundamental predictions of Albert Einstein's general theory of relativity, and a remarkable experiment that I personally thought would be impossible. And Barry helped make it happen. But what most people don't realize about Barry is that his career in physics spans a far broader area. His origins are in elementary particle physics and experiment. And so what we were able to do in our discussion was have a discussion really about the history of experimental physics, his own history, which spans so many different areas. And the importance of realizing that, in fact, you can change what you do, as he's often done. Use the things you've learned in one area and apply them to another bravely, taking risks, but always reaching out for a goal which may not be achievable, but you've got to try anyway. Barry is also one of the finest human beings I know, and it was a true pleasure to spend time talking to him. And I hope you'll find this discussion as illuminating and enjoyable as I did. So with no further ado, Barry Barish. Okay, well, thanks, Barry, for letting me intrude on your attic there and having this discussion. And it's great to
much too much time here.
Yeah, I know the feeling. Well, I'm here in our studio, which is nice. It's been a while since I've been back here. And although we've talked privately about it, I want to at least publicly congratulate you on the prize and Nobel Prize. And to say,
thanks.
And I've known you for 40 years, and I cannot think of a nicer person to get it, really, truly. So for me, I was just so happy for you. It's great.
Well, that's a nice way to start our session.
Yeah. Now, let's start. Well, so I want to talk about physics and well, a lot of science, this is an origins podcast. So I want to start with your origins, which were in Nebraska, right? Is that right?
Right.
And then you moved to LA when you were young. How old were you?
Right. Well, I was just 9, almost 10 when we moved. So it was in elementary school, 5th grade, and the school that I went to, where we moved in LA, the neighborhood was very mixed, and that's the first thing. So it had a lot of kids who weren't very academic, and a few that were. We lived up in it's called Los Feliz area in LA, but we lived on the end of it that was near Sunset Boulevard, which is where there's a lot of minorities that live and poor people. And so the school was very mixed. But there was another phenomenon then that really affected things, which is that I think ever since soon after that, and probably in your experience and most people, you talk to kids that don't do very well in school, just get moved on.
Yeah.
And at that time, that didn't happen. Kids were held back. And so when I graduated from elementary school, some of the boys went into the Navy.
Oh.
So, I was 12 and they were 16 or 18 or whatever it is. So, and that was the end of their schooling. So, but that made it especially a difficult environment for me. I came from Nebraska and hit this school where there were kids there's a big difference between teenagers and a 10-year-old.
Yeah.
So I spent, the first semester getting chased home from school.
Oh, great.
Like that. But I could run fast, so I survived it. So,
did you didn't think of going into the Navy? That didn't attract you, I assume.
And this convinced me not to go in the Navy. Yeah. So
now, did your parents have? I must admit, I happened to read something just like yesterday, a little bit about your father, I guess. But did they have any education? Did they have any?
No. So my the history is my grandparents immigrated from somewhere where you can't find it on the map anymore.
In Poland, somewhere. They were probably close to me.
Yeah, exactly. And so I've tried and I can't locate the places. And our only aunt that could have is died in the meantime. So I'm not sure where, but they came around the turn of the last century. And so my father was actually born then in the U.S. He was born in 1911 and my mother in 1913. So they were born in the U.S. But my father's family actually immigrated and didn't do what a lot of Jewish families do, which is go to New York.
New York, yeah.
Instead, they came through Chicago, and at that time, there was an act in the U.S. to try to build up the farmland. So there was this Homesteader Act.
Yeah, I know about it.
I don't know too much about it, but they got land as homesteaders in, I don't know whether it was North Dakota or South Dakota, but one of the Dakotas. And these people were not farmers, of course.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, they took a lot of people from Europe who didn't know what they were, and they sold it as if it was fertile land, and a lot of it wasn't at all. It really was quite a scam.
But I don't know what they did there because they weren't farmers, but they managed to only be there a few years and then make enough money selling the land that they moved to first to Sioux City in Iowa.
Mm-hmm.
And there they opened up, I have photographs of it. They opened up a store that sold everything. Only everything wasn't like a corner store. That is what I mean. It had tires, coal,
everything.
Ford cars. And
yeah.
And then in 1921, I have the newspaper article. My father's father had died, and my uncle had a Ford dealership, but Ford was very anti-Semitic.
Yes,
and
I read this.
It turns out he had a magazine that they put out in their equivalent of a showroom at that time, which was very anti-Semitic. My uncle and his brother got then into a fight with Ford, and it was all over newspapers and so.
I read one of the pieces from then. I did my research, and I was shocked.
Yeah, and of course that's all before I came along. But then they moved to Des Moines, Iowa, which is kind of across the river, across the Missouri River from Omaha. And there they had kind of an all-purpose store of some sort. And eventually, I don't know why, they moved to Omaha. So I was born in Omaha. My father's father had died when he was 12 or so. This is slowly getting the years started. 11 or 12, and he had to and they didn't have much money, so he had to actually go to work after school, and so he never went to college, and we don't know, but I never even thought about it till my brother said something that my brother suspects he didn't graduate from high school either, but so he basically started working when he was 13 or something. My mother was very smart and read a lot, but she was wanted to go to college and had applied to University of Nebraska and claimed I never believed her. My brother never believed her that she had a scholarship to the University of Nebraska, but her father wouldn't let her go.
Oh, interesting.
And it turns out that when she died, going through her papers, there was the letter from the University of Nebraska, and it was a true story, which we
Wow. That's amazing. That is amazing. Yeah. Oh, wow. Well, it's interesting. We share that. I mean, my father didn't graduate high school. My mother was, again, smarter. She graduated high school, but the family could only afford to send her brother to university, my uncle. And so it's now, and since we kind of share that, the interesting question is, so you didn't come from a family of people who were academics or academically inclined. Maybe did your mother instill an interest in reading or
yeah, reading. And so she read, yeah, at that time, books became cheap. You didn't have to go to the library because they made pocket books all the time. And so she read crap. She read mystery stories.
My mom too. Yeah. But
so
lots of stuff.
Boxes of mystery stories and stuff. And so I used to read. So I liked reading. Well, at first where I grew up when we moved to California was basically Hollywood or West, that area. So storytelling was always a big thing in that general environment. And I liked reading and storytelling and writing from a young age. Tried to write little stories and stuff. And I was the editor of the school newspaper and things like that, starting in junior high school. So the combination of liking to read, and I'd never read anything any good because my mother read junk.
Yeah.
But until I was about 13 or something, or 12, I don't know what age. But then I discovered somehow the Russian novels, big Russian novels. I was attracted because I knew that my family came from somewhere there. So somehow that was the reason I picked them up when I got tired of reading these mystery stories. And I fell in love with literature really at the age of 12 or 13, and I like to write. So I thought if you had asked me when, I don't know what age, but 13, 14, that I would be a novelist. That's what not a movie writer or playwright.
Yeah, but a novelist.
A novelist. That was my, and not exactly dream, but if you asked me what I was aimed at, that was what I did. I always did really well because any of us to succeed in physics are good at math. Yeah. So I was kind of a whiz at math from a young age, a whiz compared to all these kids I went to school with, and won some math contests and so forth. But I never even had the understanding that I could ever do anything with that when I was young. It was just, that part was something I enjoyed, but it didn't have any, I just didn't have any guidance at all. And then the high school that I went to, which is called Marshall High School, was good in its way, but it didn't especially do anything for me. From a very young age, I played serious tennis. It was the one thing that I was always athletic, and I played serious tennis. So I started playing tennis when I was really young, and had my parents paid for me to have some lessons. And so I actually learned how to play it right. And we didn't live far from Griffith Park, which had a huge number of tennis courts. And I'd go there after school from a very young age and just play with people. And so I played tennis competitively in tournaments and then for our high school team. And from the 9th, 10th grade or whenever you start, the time I graduated, I was the number one player. They make a ladder. And
sure. Yeah.
And so one anecdote is that in high school, you play these other high schools, and eventually I was good enough so that I was all city Los Angeles, and I tried to play on the freshman team when I went to Berkeley as an undergraduate. So I was pretty good, but not really good. But
but good enough.
But anyway, I was the number one player at Marshall High School, and we always played Van Nuys High School. This is my little anecdote.
Okay, I knew we were heading there.
And the number one player at Van Nuys High School was a little blonde kid named Bobby something or other. And it turned out, I found out years later, I had no idea until I read something that it was Robert Redford.
Oh, really?
that I played against in high school for years.
Did you beat
I
him?
learned that when I was reading at one point and realized he played he was visiting Philadelphia or someplace and played with the mayor, and it was in the newspapers, and it just clicked. And then I looked up, and it's true. He went to Van Nuys High School, and
when I hear things like that, I think how lucky it is for the world that neither of you are better tennis players.
Yeah. So when I went to Berkeley, I played tennis for a little while as a freshman, but then when I went to started having labs, I just couldn't do it. They practiced in the morning and night.
Yeah.
And I wasn't good enough anyway.
I was a wrestler. I used to wrestle, and I was actually pretty good in Canada. I won't go into it, but in university,
so similar kind
I
of.
was at a national level. I used to wrestle, but I was 114.5. It's hard to believe I ever weighed that low. But anyway,
I won't ask you what you weigh now.
Yeah, exactly. I don't want to tell you. But so this leads me to the question, which I was in. So why? I know why I mean, as we had similar backgrounds in many ways, but I know why I got interested in physics. But why you? What got you interested in science and physics?
It was all, unfortunately, I wish I could say I did it like my colleague Kip Thorne, who romantically was interested in Einstein and then general relativity. We've compared backgrounds. From the age of 15, he was going to do general relativity, but in my case, first I was going to be a novelist. When that died, and then I came from a rather poor family. I didn't have any mentor in high school, other than the tennis coach.
Interesting.
Who noticed that that all the other kids on the tennis team would come to me to help them with their problems and this and that. And so he got the idea that I should do something reasonable with my life and study and stuff. So he was the closest.
Oh, well, that's good.
Which I didn't have a personal relationship with him otherwise. But interestingly, after the Nobel Prize, one of the things I did was get invited to go back to my high school. It's not typical, of course. I hadn't been there in 50 years or whatever the number was. Yeah. And but it's still there in that part of East Hollywood, Las Vegas. And so I went back and visited, and now the gym is named after Wheeler, my tennis coach. Yeah.
His name was Wheeler?
Wheeler, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So it's sort of physics name anyway, but
yeah, right. So anyway, I once I kind of defaulted out of literature, I figured I had to do something where you used your talents and made a living.
Were your parents particularly, let me interrupt and ask, in my case, my mother wanted me to be a doctor. She decided I would be a doctor.
And of course, my parents wanted me to be a doctor if I couldn't be a lawyer. But
my brother a lawyer, me a doctor, and my brother became a lawyer, which made it even worse.
And my brother's a lawyer.
Yeah.
So it was a doctor or a lawyer. And I got the same thing when near the time I was graduating from college. You're going to go to medical school now.
Me too. My mother was so upset when I got a job at Harvard that I wasn't going to go to medical school.
Yeah. So similar kind of issue. But anyway, trying to be practical, I decided I should study engineering. So at that time, and I had no horizon past California. That was as far as I could see.
Sure.
And so going to school was either going to Stanford, Berkeley, UCLA, or Caltech. And the counselor at Marshall High School told me not to apply to Stanford because they had a quota
for Jews. Yeah.
That was her statement. I don't know if it was true.
It's quite likely at that time.
It dissuaded me, yeah. And so I applied to Berkeley and UCLA and Caltech. And but I graduated from high school at a time when high schools had mid-year graduation. So I actually graduated in January from high school.
I see.
And this is why my life has randomness. I didn't really think
that's what's great. I think randomness is really important.
So Caltech being a little school took people only, as most schools do, in September. I was graduating in January. You could enter UCLA or Berkeley in January.
Anyway, I see.
And the admissions happened in the spring for Caltech. And I went to Berkeley instead of UCLA so I could get away from home, basically.
Of course. Yeah, why not? Absolutely. Same.
And
I did the same.
So I went to Berkeley. Yeah, also, the tennis team was stronger at UCLA, and I thought I could make the tennis team at Berkeley, which ended up being an overestimation of what I could do. So I went to Berkeley, and by the time Caltech admitted me, actually, but before they admitted you, and then they told you about scholarships later.
I see.
Because I would have needed a scholarship.
Sure.
But by that time, I had fallen in love with Berkeley, not with engineering, by the way.
It was in the 60s.
Yeah, with Berkeley and with this pretty serious at the moment girlfriend.
Yeah,
so
that
it was, and there was no way I wanted to leave there, so I dropped out. Didn't follow through with Caltech.
But you entered in engineering. Did you graduate in engineering or?
No. So I'm going to get a long story of how I'm going to get the answer. I haven't forgotten your question.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
So which had to do with how did I get in physics. So I'm getting there. Okay. So I went in engineering, and freshman engineering at that time was so bad that it basically chased me out. So I had 2 courses. So I had to take freshman, math and physics and chemistry, and engineering. I had to take 2 courses as a freshman. One was engineering drafting. And now I like it because you can visualize things. Of course, now there's 3D CAD CAM, and you can, and I use it all the time. And I like the idea that you can see what you're building and everything. Yeah. But they managed, it happened to be, at that time, first, you didn't have any computerized things, and then it was very formalized. So I get criticized for my arrowheads on, something that says how long, and they didn't like my arrowheads. So I didn't like that. And then I was also very shy as a freshman, kind of shy, and personality-wise. And the other course was surveying. And they gave you this transit, and you went around the campus, and you have an exercise to go measure, the coordinates of the campanile or something in Berkeley. And the instrument was interesting. So I played around with cars when I was a kid, so I liked instruments.
Sure.
And so the instrument was interesting, and looking through it and being able to recreate where something was and reconstruct it was interesting, but that all took about an hour to master. And then it was boring because you had to do all that. And secondly, embarrassing. Standing around campus as a little freshman looking through this thing with people walking by and looking, just kind of turned me off. So drafting and in the meantime, I had freshman physics, and my instructor was Owen Chamberlain.
I know Owen. Yeah, he's a good guy.
Yeah, and this was 1958, and he had discovered the antiproton with Segre in 1955 or 6.
Had they won the Nobel Prize yet or no?
But he hadn't won the Nobel Prize yet, which is part of my.
Okay, sorry, I'm jumping ahead.
So no, part of the later story, if you follow. Okay. So anyway, but they were making discoveries. They had built the Bevatron, and they had discovered the antiproton. He hadn't gotten the Nobel Prize, but that wasn't all. He was seeing resonances and things like that, and having an instructor who himself was excited by discovery, and the fact that all these discoveries were happening in this fancy laboratory was up on the hill behind the lab, behind the campus. And even though, I was learning boring stuff like, something rolling down an inclined plane or whatever you learn as a freshman.
The most boring physics, yeah.
I got very turned on by physics immediately.
It was wonderful that they had that they didn't just have one. A lot of places just have these instructors teach first year, but to have a significant scientist teach first year is the nicest thing you can do.
Yeah, and it's just my luck. And then when I switched into physics, because I went to him talked to him about, he became my academic advisor.
Oh, wonderful.
And I didn't know that he was going to win a Nobel Prize.
Sure,
It was all
yeah,
somewhere.
sure, yeah. When you're an undergraduate, yeah.
He was just the guy. I knew he worked up the radiation lab, and I was, like all of us, I was a good student, and so I was ahead, I'd say, because in those days students didn't get to go in the lab very much. I mean, it wasn't the system like it is now, where you try to get students to join research groups. But luckily for me, I had Chamberlain as an advisor, and and so after I was a major, maybe either sophomore, I think it was even the sophomore year, except I started with this half year problem.
Yeah.
So it's hard to define what I was on. I took 3.5 years to graduate. So then I got on the September business. But anyway, he suggested that I come and partake in his research group, which was unusual because my colleagues, other students, weren't doing that. It was a combination of him and the fact that I had dropped the tennis team. I had time, and I was very good in classes, so I didn't have to, it wasn't a problem. And so he suggested it. So in those days, you've been to the radiation lab in Berkeley, I'm sure, at some point.
Yeah.
And it's up on this hill above the campus.
Yeah.
But in those days, they didn't have a shuttle bus like they do now that goes back and forth.
You have to walk. That's quite a walk. But
so you either walked or hitchhiked up. But in some way, it was a big deal to get up there. As a kid, I didn't have a car. And so I go up there. And what I remember, I go up there, and a lot of the time he was too busy for me.
Yeah.
And, now I know why it's so busy. Yeah, I've had the similar period. You've made a discovery, and there's a lot of noise around.
Yeah.
And anyway, so he was too busy. At least my memory was he was like always too busy. I'm sure it was just part of the time. So I used to wander around. I go up there, and I went out, going to turn around and go back down this hill that I just either hitchhiked or walked up. So I'd walk around the radiation lab and try to talk to people. I was a little shy, but not so shy there somehow. I don't know why. And the rules about radiation and things were much more relaxed in those days. Yeah. So I could walk around the Bevatron or around the different labs and talk to people, and they would almost talk to a young kid. But, I was getting a little bit older. So the Bevatron I found a little bit intimidating, but I went there. And then I walked further up the hill, and up the hill, there was the 184-inch cyclotron, which was the classic big cyclotron that was built in Berkeley. And
Lawrence, I guess.
Yes, it was the biggest one that Lawrence built. Yeah. Just part of my story.
Oh, sorry.
So I never knew Lawrence, of course.
Yeah.
But I'd wander around and talk to people with not very much. What are they going to do with a kid? But when I went up to the 184-inch cyclotron, there was a control room with one guy sitting in it. Now you'd have to have two for safety reasons. You can't do that. Yeah. But there was one guy, an old little guy, sitting in the control room, and then somebody would be doing experiments somewhere on the outside. And it was at that point, the 184-inch was old enough that they had a lot of equipment near it, and people would put together that equipment, maybe add something to it and do some measurement. And but anyway, this guy in the control room, he would talk to me. So he was my go-to place when I go up to the radiation lab, and Chamberlain was too busy, and I didn't have anything to do because I didn't really have any momentum that I could do more than something somebody told me to do. A short time. So he would talk to me. So I used to go and talk to him about about anything. He was a kind of talking old. Sure, yeah. I thought of him as old. He was probably 50 or something. But and of course I became interested then in the cyclotron. This is my history of getting I'm unusual for experimental physicists in that I understand accelerators very well.
Yeah.
But it started in that I understood accelerators before I understood
The physics.
experiments.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's because I went in the 184-inch cyclotron. And so he used to sit there and run this machine. And it would have these knobs, these big knobs that you and oscilloscopes. And that's all. So now it's all digital. And
of course. I remember.
And the LIGO has that. But then it was knobs. And so one knob would say, energy or something. And another one would say something else. And I would characterize it by somebody, they would have a intercom where somebody is doing an experiment would say, would you change the energy from 100 to 150 MeV or something like that? And there was this big knob that said energy. And he would twist it, but he'd also go tweak to something else. So I asked him, why'd you do that? And his answer was, because it works. Basically this guy had grown up with a machine and he knew it. Yeah. And this was kind of typical of our conversation. In the meantime, I was trying to understand how to run this machine. My goal was to understand how to run the machine. And at the time, the only kind of vestigial tale I had gotten interested in from engineering was control theory, for a reason that had to do with the fact that I was just learning matrices in mathematics, and it was an application of matrices in how you do control theory. So the way you do controls is the way you set up a control is you imagine you have the vectors that you multiply the matrix by, or energy, angle, this, that, but you're 7 or 8 different things, or 100 different variables, and then the matrix itself, if you have a perfect control system, is diagonal.
Yeah, of course.
And so what you multiply the energy multiplies the energy. If you have off diagonal terms, then you get this. And so what he was having was off. So this guy was complete. So I was diagramming what he was doing and putting it into my trivial knowledge, was not very good about control theory, and telling him that he had off diagonal terms. He had no idea what I was talking about. And of course, I didn't understand what he was doing either very much. And that was my entree into accelerators. And then I read about them. I found out about him later. So later, many years later, a little bit like Robert Redford, years later, they have all these classic pictures of the Lawrence and Macmillan and all these guys in the radiation lab. And there's always often in those pictures, there's a little guy in a white coat that's sitting right with these guys with coats and ties. And it turns out it was this guy, Jimmy Vail was his name.
Jimmy Vail.
And he was their chief technical person when they for Lawrence and Macmillan, when they made the early cyclotrons and so forth. And then at this point, he owned the 184-inch but I never knew that when I knew him. I only knew that, years later. So that's,
that was a lot. I mean, I think it's a wonderful thing for kids. I advise young kids who are interested in science in any way to get out of the classroom and to just see the research experience at some level, to see what it's all about. And you were lucky to sort of fall into that, I guess.
Yeah, I just fell into it. And
now you said before we go forward, something interesting. You said you used to play with cars. I'm wondering. I want to ask. What I want to get to at the beginning is why experiment rather than theory, but because I was when I was a good student and et cetera, but I actually worked in a lab as an undergraduate, and that's what convinced me not to become an experimentalist.
Really?
Yeah. But because it just took so long, I worked on actually spark chambers, and I was designing one, and it took me months and months and months and months to get this thing to work at all, and it just seemed so slow compared to what I could do with theory. I think that for me at the time.
You should have started with cars. You would have been.
Yeah, no, I know. Yeah, well,
Yeah,
let me cars. I want to ask you about cars and electronics. You didn't do ham radio or any of that kind of thing, because that's a lot of experimentalists do that kind of stuff too.
I didn't do ham radio, but I built radios. So I did as a kid, starting with a crystal set.
Yeah, I had a crystal set.
Yeah,
but
and but I didn't do ham radios, but I built one.
So that was the electronic stuff, but the mechanic stuff was cars. You played with cars. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so my family, I mentioned that they had Ford cars, and then migrated into cars. I mean, I grew up with cars because they had a car deal. The reason they came to California was to open up a new car dealership. So it wasn't Ford, it was Chrysler Plymouth. So my father's uncle, my father had died, as I said, when he was young, but my father's uncle was the boss, the owner, basically. My father worked with him or for him his whole life. And my jobs as a kid, when I started working in high school, were there. In my the first summer I worked, when I was in high school, I worked with the guy who balanced tires.
Tires? Okay.
Yeah. So then when you bought a new tire, put a new tire on a car, you had to do something to make it go around in a true way. So you put these little weights on it.
Yeah, I remember that.
That did that. And very much, it had a machine, and they had some guy that did this, but he didn't understand anything. So what I had done, and when I was 15 or 16, because each summer my father had me do something else, and I worked with the one I remember first was I worked with the guy that balanced, put on new tires or balanced the system. And I got interested in the only thing that was good from all the reading and everything is I spent a lot of time in libraries, and I understood how to answer my own, since I didn't have parents, and answer my questions using libraries. And so that came about also when I had this summer job. I decided to learn about suspension systems and the shock absorbers and all the whole system and how it works. So I went to the library, and because that's what I was working with.
Sure.
I went to the library, and there were lots of books that you could read. So it wasn't long before I knew a lot more about the suspension systems than the guy that was my boss in the summer. And interestingly, I started with suspension systems, and it's the key to making gravitational wave detection was the seismic system.
Isolation.
Yeah, which is what you do in the car. So my first summer doing it, I did that. And then when I learned to drive, I delivered parts. That was just driving around LA. But then I worked with the painter and did different things. But then at home, I had my first car, and first cars weren't very good cars. And I took apart and rebuilt the engines and things like that.
That's crucial.
It's very satisfying way to start with using equipment, because it is just the opposite of what you found. There's almost instant gratification because you do something. There's not that many ways. You can screw it up, but if you know what you're doing, you do something and it works better or fixes something. And so working on a car has that. I mean, I didn't make hot rods or anything. Yeah. But anything you did, improve things or you learned something. So there was working on something as simple basically as a gas combustion engine and trying to make it work better when they have flaws because they overheated. They, had this problem or that problem. That it was fun. I wasn't though a kid who spent an infinite amount of time on it. I was busy playing tennis, but I did do enough so it gave me.
It gives you satisfaction.
And a hands-on, to answer your question, a hands-on orientation. So I always liked being around equipment.
And since you started in engineering, I mean, obviously you had a practical bent. I was just wondering, did you ever toy with doing theory or theoretical?
Yeah, well, my hero. Once I learned about physics, then you develop your hero, and so my hero, which was true for quite a long time, probably until I was until I had a second one, which was fine when I came to Caltech.
Yeah,
I was Enrico Fermi.
Of course, great hero.
and really no, but particularly I think what attracted me was the fact that he did both theory and
It was
experiment,
the last really
which was
great
my
experimental.
goal. Where I didn't succeed, but my goal as a scientist was to do both. Actually,
No one succeeded in at least a fundamental in particle physics after Fermi or nuclear physics. I mean, he was the last. I think the last great person who was equally good at theory and experiment.
yeah. I mean, he did.
It's amazing.
He did his weak interaction theory, and 6 months later did the slow neutrons to
and amazing. You know, I gave a lecture once in his 100th anniversary at Fermilab, actually, and boy, then I discovered not only did they do that, I don't know how they did anything because he taught 3 classes, and I mean it's a different world back then. Yeah,
and he was unbelievable. I think. I mean,
he was great. Yeah,
I
never met him, but
so he was my nor I, but he was my idol kind of, and then later Feynman, because I was in the same institution, but but in a different way. By the way, I'm always happy. So I did think that that's what I was going to. At some stage, I was going to do both, like Fermi, but somehow life didn't turn out that way.
Well, it's probably just as well, in a way, because what I was going to do next is that so you're in Berkeley. Did you get your PhD in 1962, or did you enter? I forget when you. I have a number, 1962. Is that when you got your PhD?
I finished my thesis in 62. I think they gave the PhD the next June. Maybe
yeah. But it doesn't matter. The point is that, and it's probably just as well. It seems to me that you were doing. If you think of the history of physics, and now I want to move into your history of physics, which is the wonderful thing I want to go through is all the different areas of physics you've done. And I know a lot of people probably lately just have been talking about LIGO, but I've known you for a lot longer and the diversity of areas of physics is what I find particularly interesting. But in 62, what we would call particle physics, but nuclear particle physics, was in a theoretical turmoil, but an experimental celebration in a sense. As you say, Chamberlain and it was a time when all these new particles had just been discovered, and if you're an experimentalist, it was a heyday. But as a theorist, it looked like the world was ending in the sense that everything sensible was going out the window. Did you get a sense of that as a student? Did you get a sense of that?
Yeah, even more complicated, I think. That there was all this sense of discovery because the particles were being discovered, which is what got me into the field. As I said, starting it only accelerated from the time I was an undergraduate. And the reason, of course, that I chose to stay in Berkeley was all these discoveries were very much centered around Berkeley. Yeah. So, they told me that they didn't keep their own undergraduates, but the year that I graduated, they kept 3 of us. So, I stayed in Berkeley exactly for that reason, the discovery. Along the way, it started to become a problem, no longer a great exciting thing. You can only discover so many particles before it's just confusion.
Yeah.
And people started making crazy discoveries. There was a double discovery, and if you remember, a double bump, things like that. And before I came to Caltech, I must be a year or 2 years before, when I got my degree, Murray Gell-Mann came to Berkeley and gave a talk on the Eightfold Way, which is the beginning of the order to this system, which was in itself, I think, one of the probably the most exciting development I've seen scientifically of experiment and theory coming together in some way. I mean, a little bit odd because he did it from this mathematical thing rather than some physical, rather than, say, a lot of what Fermi did, say, in beta theory or something came out of understanding physics. He did it by taking group theory and applying it somehow. And it was unique in the sense. I'm just trying to give some background for others, but
while Dirac had predicted a particle, he really hadn't predicted it. He didn't believe it.
Right.
But I think it was the first time. I mean, and it's Pauli had predicted a neutrino, I guess, but it was the first time from that I can think of where from some abstract theoretical picture you could predict the existence of a particle, and then lo and behold, what do you know? It existed. Must have been amazing. It must have been truly amazing.
So the way I remember it, I'm not sure I'm accurate, but I think pretty close, is that the whole picture had some blanks. The cascade particle wasn't found yet, but it was found while he was still doing this. But then once that was found, then he wrote the following paper where he predicted exactly what the omega minus would be. It was the last missing particle in this group.
Yeah.
And he could predict its mass and all the decay modes and all this. And then luck came in because there was a big race to look for it in Berkeley and in CERN and at Brookhaven. And there's only twice in my life of things that are close to me where an experiment has been definitive based on one observation. And this usually, it's a candidate.
Of course. Yeah.
But this was the bubble chamber picture of the omega minus. And they were lucky because all the photons that came out converted. And so it was overly determined and it gave exactly the mass. And it was unbelievable that a normal experiment and other omega minuses would have taken more than one because you didn't see all the particles. Because they didn't all. The second time, of course, was, which I didn't think could possibly happen, was our observation of gravitational waves based on the first event, event.
Platinum event. Yeah. That's it. Yeah. And the omega minus, that's what led to Murray's Nobel Prize, I guess, is the ability. I mean, that omega minus must, again, it was before my time as a physicist, but having studied the history of particles, it was definitive. It was just amazing because
absolutely definitive.
And he was the type who would just have played it up anyway, Murray. But
and so that was the transition time for me. It was the last part of my Berkeley time. Was he actually gave the seminar for that, which was on what he called the Eightfold Way at that point.
Sure.
And then the discovery of I don't remember the year exactly, of the omega minus sealed it. And when I came to Caltech, the same ideas, by the way, were generated by George Zweig.
Yeah.
But he was at CERN.
Mm-hmm.
He was a Caltech student. He got his PhD. He got hired back at Caltech, but he was before he came back to be on the faculty, he was at CERN. So when I came as a postdoc to Caltech, he wasn't around. And by the time he came back, he decided he wasn't going to do theory anymore. So I never understood how truly independent that was, how much they interacted. It was really hard to tell as a young researcher. I just never.
Yeah. Well, the good thing about, it's all, especially theory. That's one of the reasons I'll tell you, in later life, not that I regretted, but I envied experimentalists, because if you're a theorist, you really can't show something as yours very effectively. If you're an experiment, you actually do something. You produce something. It's real. It's undeniable. There's this machine. There's this data. It's there. But if you're a theorist, it's very murky, and it's fine. And you learn to. And as far as I'm concerned, the more the merrier. I mean, because it is a cooperative part of science that people don't realize, and it's not individuals sitting alone at night and and revelations at blackboards. But it is interesting in things like that. Who did what exactly? It's not, if you're a theorist, it's not so clear. And but the good thing, as I say, is Gell-Mann, if that he didn't just need the omega minus to be shown to be one of the remarkable theorists of his time. And anyway, so by then, of course, by the postdoc, you committed to doing experiment, and you'd grown, and you've been lucky to be thrust at the center of particle physics, really, which was Berkeley, at a time when experimentally there was just a heyday. I mean, it was just, anytime you turned on a machine, you suddenly saw a particle. And and the theorists were, as I say, tearing out their hair and giving up on things like quantum field theory. In fact, it's interesting because I'll be talking to another friend of ours, David Gross, soon, and he was at Berkeley around that time when the theorists were in fact doing just that, giving up on our present picture. But then you and yeah, so I looked at your PhD, it's subject, pions and protons and stuff. But when I first knew you, which is now jumping ahead, but by then you had established, you'd begun to work on my favorite particle in nature, neutrinos, and had worked on a key experiment, which really established the standard model of particle physics, and it helped our good friend Shelley Glashow win the Nobel Prize, and because this theory of the weak interaction, which had initially been his, and then Steve Weinberg, but they had predicted not just new particles, but a new kind of interaction that was like photons but different, and I guess it was recognized. I don't know how I want you to explain this to me, how clearly recognized it was that neutrinos were the way to see it, and whether that was your goal. I mean, you worked on the experiment that eventually showed. There have been a lot of experiments that showed there weren't weak neutral currents, and it held things back for a while in the early 70s. And I sort of entered graduate school right in 1977, right around the time that I remember, I think Weinberg was very excited because the experiments had now shown there was a weak neutral current. And anyway, so you worked on that. You want to give the history of that a little bit?
Yeah. There was a new accelerator being built. So that was what's now Fermilab.
Yeah.
And there had been a very important experiment with neutrinos that had been done at Brookhaven Lab. And that established that there were two kinds of neutrinos at that time, the muon neutrino and the electron neutrino. So that was a big discovery that happened
Sure.
at a period when I was working at Brookhaven, near the period when I did some work at Brookhaven. I did an experiment there that you didn't read about because we didn't discover anything.
Yeah, that's right. Like most experiments and like most theory, people don't realize it's just, most of the time you're making baby progress. Not anyway. Go on.
Yeah. And I've always been someone that looked at what you can do. What happens in experiment is there's new possibilities because there's new instruments or new techniques.
Yeah.
Not just new ideas, okay, or not just because you measured something before. So I've always been kind of opportunistic in thinking that you can apply, solve problems that couldn't be solved before, or do experiments that couldn't be done before because of new instruments. So I was quite interested in just the idea that this new accelerator was going to be built at
Fermilab in
Fermilab. Yeah, then called National Accelerator Laboratory at the beginning. And I had worked at Brookhaven on anti-proton annihilation, which I thought was going to be the great avenue to phenomenal discoveries because it hadn't been done before. We didn't discover anything, so you haven't mentioned that. But I went to Brookhaven to do that, leading the group, which I was part of, that was doing electron scattering at SLAC, and that did electron scattering, positron electron scattering, and then deep inelastic scattering, and made a discovery. I quit that experiment to go to Brookhaven. Never could I forget that. Never could that be forgotten by Dick Taylor, who was my good friend, who would take any opportunity to tell me what an idiot I was to leave, because it was originally not MIT SLAC, it was MIT Caltech SLAC on those experiments.
Okay, I was going to ask ask about mistakes or errors or things you overlooked, but
yeah. So
you did an experiment which did win the Nobel Prize.
I wouldn't have won the Nobel Prize because I was
Yeah,
younger, but I was younger, but
but it would have been an experiment that would have.
but I was a player in that experiment. Yeah, I designed a lot of what's in the instrument that they used. Um, I designed something else which wasn't used for that, but the positron source, which was only recently taken out of the accelerator at SLAC. But I quit to go off to do something at Brookhaven. Anyway, so I was quite aware of both the scattering experiments at SLAC with electrons, which we had done, and I was part of in the early days. And I was aware and admired the two neutrino experiment when it was done at Brookhaven. So I'd say the main thing for me was my eyes were open.
Yeah.
And that Fermilab, when it was being built, provided what I viewed as a new opportunity to do things. And I think the first thing is that I thought that neutrinos were going to be a great probe compared to electrons, which have problems.
Yeah. Well, okay. Why? I think I know why, but I'd like to hear your answer.
Well, basically that they're not shielded by a lot of other backgrounds. They basically, when they scatter off the things you care about, and when the interactions are the weak interaction, which is very fundamental. And so to me, it was, and they hadn't been done because you didn't have any instruments. I mean, basically the two neutrino experiment didn't use neutrinos in the same way to scatter them or do anything.
Yeah.
So it's something that just hadn't been done at all. And having come from knowing about accelerators and so forth, I had the idea that if you did it right, you could build a very intense neutrino beam. It had never been done because the neutrinos that were used were always into a bubble chamber or a few into something. They didn't really have much of a neutrino beam to do Letterman's experiment. So I had an idea of how you could make a very intense neutrino beam. Not only that, how you could make it so it had defined energy. So it wasn't just neutrinos of all energy, but defined energy. And so I collaborated with Frank Scully. I don't know if you know him.
I know him.
He was a junior faculty like me at Caltech. And the two of us basically designed this experiment and proposed it as one of the first round experiments at Fermilab. And the vision was mixed. First, really exploratory, I'd say. Not driven by theory, but this is a whole new way
window.
A new window, and that instrumentally, you had a new accelerator. You could make much higher energy, and we knew how to make this beam. That you could make a beam of neutrinos.
Yeah,
and that would be focused and of known energy, and then there were a series of possible things you could do with it. So one was, I was aware of the neutral currents, but it wasn't on top of the list. I'd say it was third or fourth on the list of things we thought we would do. It was, of course, part of the design, one of the things we wanted to do, but I wouldn't say that was number one. The first goal was to be able to do neutrino. We had two main goals. One was to search and find the W boson, which at that time wasn't going to weigh 80 GeV, but was thought.
And again, I'll interrupt just for the listeners. The W boson was one of the new particles that was predicted in the theory of the weak interaction that carried the weak interaction, and indeed, people thought that it was probably light enough to detect, right? Yeah, at that time.
Yeah, they thought it was light enough to detect, and that was going to be our discovery. So to be honest with you, that was going to be our discovery. That was the first thing we wanted to look for.
Sure.
And the highest priority in kind of the design of the experiment was how do we find the W boson up to 5 GeV or something, less than 1/10 of where it ended up. And the second goal was so I guess maybe neutral currents were third. The second goal was to do the SLAC experiments with a better probe. That is with this deep inelastic scattering equivalent.
Again, I'm just going to translate that for people. So the thing about the SLAC experiment and the reason why the Nobel Prize, it was a probe of the protons that ultimately detected the existence of these particles called quarks that appeared to be interacting relatively freely inside the protons, which is a real surprise. And you can use probes. That's the way you do things. And you hit the proton, you see what comes out. And electrons were one probe, and so you realize that that neutrinos could be another probe.
Yeah, and a better probe because they basically don't have other things they do. So they scatter off these quark-like objects inside or point-like objects.
Let me again. I'm just still going to translate a little bit for the electrons interact electromagnetically. They have charge and they interact weakly, whereas the neutrinos, for people, that's what makes neutrinos so special. They don't have charge, so they only interact with the weak interaction. Sorry, I just wanted to give people a preface.
Okay. And so we did that, and that of course is important. So that was the second goal. The first goal we failed at. W boson. That was the second goal. The third goal was neutral currents. And
you expected to see them, though.
Well, we didn't know. I mean, there was no evidence yet. When we designed that, there was no evidence.
There was anti-evidence, wasn't there? I mean, when did
there was anti-evidence a little bit later. We designed in about 1968, 69. And so at the time so that's the thoughts at that time. In the year before we detected neutral currents, the single event was seen in the bubble chamber a single event was seen in the bubble chamber. It wasn't definitive at CERN,
I guess.
CERN. And then we saw it in 1972 or 73. There was a lot of fuzziness in between. I would say the advocates, say Weinberg, theoretical advocates, were not as definitive merely in, you're just going to find this thing, as, say, Murray was about the omega minus, which we talked about earlier. So this was not, yes, it was a byproduct, but I don't think they were.
Until it's really quite amazing. I mean, again, in the history of physics, I mean, Weinberg's paper on the weak interactions of called leptons, particles like electrons and neutrinos, which is now one of the most cited theoretical papers in the world, did not have a citation. He wrote it in 67 for 3 or 4 years. I mean, it's sort of a model, and I don't know whether I've talked to Steve about this, but I don't remember the answer whether he took how seriously he took it, but didn't promote it a lot, and it was an interesting idea, but it wasn't, so as you say, it didn't capture. It took a few years before people realized it put into broader context and realized how natural it was, and I don't know whether Shelley, again, I mean, you might have talked to Shelley.
Again, for your audience, there was neutral currents, but they were always strangeness changing.
Yeah.
So what we knew was that in the decay of strange particles, there was channels that were equivalent to neutral currents. What was predicted here was you didn't have to have strangeness involved.
And strangeness is a quality of just a name applied to quarks. They have different there's color, and and there's the up quark, down quark, and then there's a strange quark, and they have different names, and it's really just a quantum mechanical property.
And it's also a particle property because it's K mesons and lambda. So the neutral current at that time only involved these particles which had the strange quark, but they basically were the lambda and this involved, could you have strangeness changing, non-strangeness changing neutral currents? And
that was the big deal. But it's interesting that you went for the W. I'm relating because when I first met you, it was 1980. I remember vividly because we were together in Scotland, and I was a graduate student in a Scottish summer school, and you were talking about neutrinos then, by the way. But at the time, it was kind of interesting because the experimentalists were looking for the top quark. And do you remember? I mean, and so the theorists would throw bones out, just like the W. Oh, you'll discover the W if you do this next experiment. It's only going to be 5 GeV. No, but it'll be 10 GeV. No, 20. And I remember it was exactly the same with the top quark. Remember, theorists were coming up with predictions just beyond what the experimentalists could see, and the next experiment wouldn't see it in the next. Do you remember that?
Yeah. Until it got to be so heavy that it took. That's the longest discovery paper I've ever read. It's the discovery of the top quark is a 200-page paper to make it. It's so difficult to actually isolate it when it's so heavy that it's
decays really quickly. Now, look, so what I wanted to clarify for people in case they didn't know this is that your neutrino experiments were very important in helping establish the fundamental model of physics. Because again, I think for a lot of people now, because you won the Nobel Prize for LIGO, don't recognize the background of experiments that you worked on, and I think it's important. But more than that, what's intrigued me, and I knew I also knew you at a time when I was kind of floundering, and I didn't know whether I really wanted to continue to do theory. I was really not particularly happy, and you were a wonderfully pleasant, kind person to talk to, and I remember, and we'll get to it, because I remember you actually offered me a chance I was a student at MIT to spend a summer working on another experiment you worked on, which we'll get to, called macro. And I regret that I never got to do that. I don't know whatever happened, but I think I do know what happened. But anyway, I didn't get to. I really wished I wanted to have the experience of working on an experiment to see. But the reason it's a segue to macro is that one of the things that I appreciated early about you, which I came to realize as I became a physicist and our careers sort of moved along, and I got to know different aspects, is the jumping around. I mean, I remember when you went from accelerators to macro, which we'll talk about, which is an underground physics experiment. And I remember you just saying, yeah, well, it's just different, it's similar techniques. You try new things and it's no big deal, but it seemed like a big deal to me. But before we get to that transition for you, I wanted to ask you, you've chosen to work on, there were neutral currents, macro, and then we'll talk about GEM, the LHC, the superconducting supercollider experiment, and then ultimately LIGO. Each one of them in their own way could have been Nobel Prize winning experiments, depending upon how it went. Did that affect your choice? Did you choose? I mean, it's easy after the fact, and so maybe with hindsight you'll say yes, but one can do experiments that are like bread and butter. Okay, I'm going to do the experiment I've already done, but I'm going to improve it and tweak it, and I'm going to make a career of this or that. Or you can say, I'm only going to work on things that have that can have a dramatic impact. Did that govern your choice at all? And the answer no is fine.
Yeah, but no, it's of course, like all things, it's more complicated than that. I went into physics in a somewhat romantic way, as you said. So and I've never been fearful of doing something that's different from what I did before. So in some sense, this romanticism carries, and I have pretty good confidence that I can do what I try to do. Experimentally, but I can assess it and do it. And so at any given time, I've basically been attracted to the most exciting and interesting thing I think I can do. Wonderful. And I failed. It's quite a few. But
failing is important. People don't realize how it's incredibly important in physics and in business.
So we mentioned one already. I failed to find the W boson. We're going to talk now about Gran Sasso, which was a great thing to learn about Italy and Italian and so forth. But the reason I went there goes back to when I once saw you, which is, I don't know if you know the history. The history started in Scotland.
Yes.
Know that? Do you know my history of that?
No, I know.
Okay, so you remember there were 4 lectures there, as I remember it. I may be wrong. And I lectured every other day. So, and Shelley lectured on the odd day but it was every other day. And the lecture of my day was 't Hooft.
Exactly.
And
it was a good summer school, by the way, because Tufte won the Nobel Prize after that. You won the Nobel Prize. It was a good summer school. Anyway,
so he lectured before I lectured,
uh-huh.
and in those days we used transparencies.
Yeah.
No slides or no blackboards, but transparencies. And I used to go to his lectures, which were before mine on that day. Understood not so much.
Yeah.
He was talking. He's very mathematical anyway, but he was talking about grand unification. At least the part that I remember was about grand. Not that he had any grand unification, but he was talking about how grand unification would work if you used non-abelian gauge theories. Basically, if it's based on the same mathematics that we always use.
Which he had because of him, they became interesting in physics. And I mean, it's one of the many things that Tufte did. But he was talking very mathematically, and I met as a student,
and he was talking and.
I was just going to say, as a theorist, I also didn't understand a lot of what he's talking about at the time.
But that was perfect for me because I would finish up polish my transparencies, or what you want to call it, finish my talk while half listening to him, and then I would give my lecture. So, but at one point he showed that if you use non-abelian gauge theories are the same mathematics, so in general, and formed a grand unified theory from it, that there were singularities that existed that he identified as having the properties of a monopole.
Magnetic monopole. Yeah.
Magnetic monopole. But they would have a mass that was something like the unification mass.
Which is 16 orders of magnitude larger than the mass of proton, again, for people.
And so it turns out that one of my first kind of curiosities as a physicist that made me try to understand things as an experimentalist was the fact that the Maxwell's equations aren't symmetrical.
Yeah, sure. They're electric charges, but there are no magnetic charges. Again, I'm just filling in for
the rest of it otherwise is symmetrical between E and M. And to me, symmetry is everywhere. And why is there this asymmetry? And maybe it's not there because we just haven't found the little m that goes in the little q. So this goes back to my undergraduate days, my interest in it. So I was interested always in searches for magnetic monopoles. They were very simple to understand.
Yeah.
And they were done from, I knew about them from even when I first came to Caltech, maybe a little after, Jerry Wasserberg in geology got moon rocks.
And looked for.
And I spent time with them in geology at Caltech for a while, talking about whether they could find magnetic monopoles in the moon rocks. Because the idea then was the monopoles would hit the moon and there'd be a concentration of them in these moon rocks.
I remember that at the time. And because a lot of people, again, I hope you don't mind if I preface for the listeners.
No, go.
That magnetic monopoles had been interesting in physics. Obviously, the symmetry that you talked about was fascinating. Dirac was the person who made it interesting. It sort of made them the idea that a magnetic monopole might exist, because he showed something remarkable in 1936, I think, that if a single magnetic monopole existed, you could understand why electric charge was quantized. It's a big mystery. Why do all charges come in multiples of the? And it was a remarkable thing, and that made it interesting. But there was no guidance of whether, and people had looked for them, but there was no guidance that they should exist. But then around the time when you and I were at that summer school, and these things called grand unified theories had been developed a few years before, there was suddenly a prediction that these things, if those theories were there, these particles had to be there, and they would be very massive. Sorry, I just wanted to give that.
Yeah. Just what you said is true. Now, I was interested in them from before, moon rocks, searches with cosmic rays, all based on one of the first things that kind of We all learned Maxwell's equations as students that I didn't understand, and maybe I didn't understand it because we just hadn't found it yet. So I was interested. Yeah, I was interested in it from the beginning. I didn't know enough. The first I heard that these magnetic monopoles would be supermassive was in this lecture at
Scotland.
In Scotland, yeah.
Wow.
And sitting there, I probed my memory, and because I happened to be interested in the subject of magnetic monopoles, it quickly occurred to me that if I was right, that magnetic monopoles had that there had been all these searches for magnetic monopoles, but there had been basically a fundamental assumption that never appeared in the print that people made, but maybe they made subconsciously, but usually you put all your assumptions before you do something, that the mass of the monopole was something like the mass of other particles, like the proton or some other particles. And so I went through, instead of listening to those lectures after that, I was going through everything I remembered about magnetic monopoles, that is searches in cosmic rays, or the searches, and on accelerators. You couldn't make a heavy one on an accelerator. So I went through everything I knew and convinced myself, I thought, there was no library, if you remember, in St. Andrews, but I convinced myself, at least close enough, that that all those searches had to be thrown away. They had nothing to do with these new kind of proposed magnetic monopoles that would be super heavy. So then I thought about how you might detect them. And I thought about something else that I happen to know at that point, which is interesting. That is that because I had worked at Fermilab, I was quite familiar with the physics department at Chicago, and they had offered me a job. So it's the one place I almost left Caltech for, was to go to Chicago, because I worked at Fermilab. Because of that, I was quite familiar with the department there, because it was a long courtship kind of with Cronin and me. And we didn't go basically because of Simone. It wasn't me, because of my wife. She decided that it was too much hard for her to start a new practice in psychology there. But I probably would have gone if she had agreed.
Wow.
So anyway, I knew the department very well. And one person who intrigued me was Parker, Eugene Parker.
Parker, yeah.
And
great scientist.
And he had written a paper that I had read, that I remembered in Scotland, which was that, but I didn't remember the numbers, but I remember in Scotland that he had basically shown that the limits on that you have magnetic fields in the
galaxy and the galaxy and in the solar system, and monopoles would eat them up.
Yeah, right. And so if you have too many monopoles, they would short out these magnetic fields, and you wouldn't have magnetic fields, okay, because you had the currents that shorted out. And so he had something called the Parker bound, which meant that there couldn't be any above this level. And that I remembered, and I turned out to be pretty close to right, but I remembered it because of, being connected to Chicago. These old things come about in a funny way.
Sure.
When I went home, of course, I looked up all this, and I had remembered it pretty much right. And the result was that you needed to make something that was very large, because the flux of monopoles couldn't be very big, because they would short out the fields. Okay. And so I took on the challenge of, how do you make something very large? And in the meantime, others had gotten interested in it, and one of them was a colleague that I respect very much, but he made a mistake, unfortunately. That was Cabrera at Stanford. And we had some informal meetings of people that were interested in finding monopoles. This is like 1981, I think. What year were we in Scotland? It's a year
we
after.
Were in, it was 1980. We were in Scotland. And
so 1981, there were maybe...
Cabrera's discovery of a monopole was
82.
82 is
82.
Valentine's
So,
Day. Valentine's Day, 1982. I remember
yeah.
it now.
So in 1981, it turns out there were, a dozen or so physicists who were interested in grand unified monopoles informally, and we talked to each other. And of course, so I knew a lot about what Cabrera was doing. And I also had convinced myself that you needed something, 10 to the fourth times bigger than what he was building, this ring, which is a beautiful idea because you develop the monopole goes through and it makes a unique amount of current. And so I was designing something that was huge. And my idea was I'd make something, and I had students working with me, and we were trying to make something that we could put underneath the football field at Caltech was the first idea. And then I became aware that they were making this new tunnel and laboratory in Europe. So so that had the advantage that you could go deep underground and have a big space, which meant it made it much easier in terms of what kind of experiment you had to do. Yeah. If you did it on the Earth's surface or just under the football field at Caltech, you had to get rid of all cosmic rays that went through. But if you went deep underground, there were so few that got that deep that you did it in a different way.
Yeah.
So it migrated into that. I don't remember exactly where I was in that thinking at the time that Cabrera had found his signal, which made me very happy on one hand and very upset on the other hand.
Yeah, sure.
I was upset that I had been somehow misled myself, that I needed something huge when I probably didn't, because but the experiment turned out to be wrong.
Well, has anyone ever, we don't know if it's wrong. It could be one monopole in the universe, and he might have discovered it.
It just happened to go through that loop. You're right. Yeah. It's not wrong. It's just misleading.
It's misleading. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So it's a wonderful experiment, and he's a very good scientist.
Yeah, he's a former collaborator of mine too. Yeah, on dark matter.
And so anyway, by the time his thing had come and gone, and we developed the ideas further, it turned out that the place to go was Italy. So I went to discover the magnetic monopole. That was the original reason to go. Of course, we saw other things, like we were the confirming experiment to the neutrino oscillation experiment done in Japan. Maybe we should have discovered it before then, but it was a secondary goal for us. But looking for magnetic monopoles, then I spent 10 years. So that's risk, which we came back to. Yeah. I spent 10 years. We didn't find any. So,
that's it. That's the other thing. That's the other reason I probably didn't want to become experimentalist, because you can spend, big experiments like you did, take 10 years, 20 years, and then you can sometimes not see anything. And it can be, I imagine for me, it would be frustrating. I remember at the time thinking,
it's not frustrating, because all of it's fun.
Yeah, that's the point. And you would tell me it was fun, and that was nice. But I remember thinking, wow, Barry's just taking this on, and it's really amazing. First of all, I was shocked that one could go from accelerators to non-accelerators, and it helped create a paradigm for large underground experiments, which of course have become a central part of physics, and I've been involved in them myself. And then, but you said, well, it's fun. And that's why I thought, oh, well, I'll go and spend a summer and see how fun it is. And who knows what would have happened. But anyway, but I didn't, and you didn't. And then I thought, well, they didn't see it. Poor Barry, that's his career. And then we'll jump ahead. And then the United States decided to build around before that, but that it was important for years, in order to discover the real nature of the electroweak theory, the Standard Model, to build the definitive accelerator. And it was going to be built in Texas, the superconducting super collider. And and so you'd have this null result, which was important. By the way, again, null results are important. You demonstrated that at the level that one might have expected to see for the simplest grand unified theories, that the monopoles didn't exist. And that was important in guiding, one of the things that helped guide theory. So I don't want to diminish it, but the superconducting super collider was going to be built It was going to be the definitive experiment, the largest accelerator in the world, an amazing 62-mile machine underground in Texas, and another significant experimentalist was going to be involved in building one of the machines and did one of the detectors, and that fell through. And then I remember actually at the time I was at Yale, I was professor at Yale at the time, and people were talking about who might do it. I remember I had my friend Charlie Balte, who was a colleague of yours, and is it worth the gamble of seeing if the SSC is going to be built? And then someone like you decided it was worth the gamble to build this thing. So let's take us to the SSC now.
Yeah, well, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow that we were looking for there was the Higgs boson.
Yeah. And it was definitively designed to be able, unlike the CERN, by the way, which we should point out, I've always said, wasn't, it was going to detect
absolutely.
the LHC.
The machine was designed for it, and the experiment that I and colleague Bill Willis,
who I also knew,
designed. Yeah, he was at Yale earlier, and then he was at Columbia when I was working with him. And he's dead, unfortunately. But
yeah, I rented his house in Geneva.
He was my colleague. But we designed this experiment to detect the Higgs boson, and it was much more optimal than the.
Yeah, it was going to. If it was there, this was definitive. It was going to be lucky.
The machine would have produced more, but the experiment also had. We took tremendous lengths to make sure there was no material, so that you could really see this gamma gamma mode and so forth and so on.
It was called GEM, right? It was a GEM of a machine.
Yeah.
And then what happened?
Well, the politicians canceled the dumb machine, but
I remember. Yeah, I mean the politicians. It was the machine that was. It was the dumbest decision. One of the many dumb decisions.
It was a new Congress, a new conservative Congress. They had to show that they were going to save money, so they came in under that guise, and it was either going to be so they had to cut out something visible, and it was on the technical side. I don't know other things too, and that was either the space station or the super collider in Texas.
And it was such a mistake to keep the space station, in my opinion. But I remember it was a disaster for particle physics in this country. I had become chairman of a physics department a year before the superconducting super collider was canceled, and there were lots of things that. I mean, the point is, it wasn't the science. There was punishing the Texas congressional delegation. There was all this. It was all politics. And I remember when it was canceled, I was hiring. I moved there to hire 12 new faculty, which is one of the reasons I left Yale to move to Case. And I got 250 applications from scientists who'd been at the SSC, and their whole careers had left their jobs, had left their institutions, and all of that expertise was about to die. And I do remember once again thinking, poor Barry, that's his career. He put all his eggs in that basket. And first macro, and it was brilliant, but didn't see anything. And then the SSC. Well, he's a nice guy, and he'll just have a happy life. And I thought, and there were a lot of people who did leave the field because of that. But you went on to do something else. And again, it was fortunate, I guess, the accidents of life, and I found them for me too. But you didn't go to Chicago. Had you gone to Chicago, you never would have been involved in LIGO, I assume. I mean, it would have been. You wouldn't have made Caltech, which is the center. Yeah. But tell me about the transition, because it was a while, of course, after it was the SSC was killed in well, I guess the SSC was killed in 92, right? Is that right?
The SSC was killed in 93.
93, and then and you started with LIGO in 94.
Yeah, there was very little time, so I'll explain it. First, it's not that I'm lucky the SSC was canceled, because we would have discovered the Higgs.
Yeah. That would have been a different.
And that
prize.
Was a pretty important discovery, and it would have been way
prize.
Before it was finally discovered.
Yeah,
so
it would have been 20 years.
I was on the right path. But at Caltech's a really small place, and as you know, I mean, we were 1,000 undergraduates, 1,000 graduate students,
1,000 faculty,
and it hasn't grown. It's had a guideline of 1% a year growth for the faculty, students, and so forth since I've been there. It's grown less than that. So, I've been there that many years. It basically has almost no growth, but they have a little room for it if the trustees agree to it. Basically, the planning is around zero growth. There's a fundamental difficult question, which is with zero growth, how do you stay in the forefront of physics in a physics department? That's not a simple question. And
Sure.
I'm not sure I can answer how Caltech has succeeded, but it's stayed pretty well at the forefront of physics, despite the fact that since the time I came, which is quite a long time ago now, there's been essentially zero growth. The physics department is within a couple positions the same size as it was. And if you look at most new fields that open up or something, you do it by growth. Maybe things die away slowly. But at Caltech, it means I don't think we have a magic formula for it, but it does mean that we're very more uniformly involved in new appointments.
Well, yeah, there is a little bit of magic thing. It's called money. Caltech has a lot of it, but go on.
Yeah, but number of people, money in terms of attracting good people.
Yeah.
But in terms of how you make new appointments, they're really a big department-wide.
Yeah, sure, because it's a big deal.
It's a big deal, and there's no stickiness. If somebody retires or leaves out of one field, there's no real advantage to get somebody in the same area. That's not exactly true, but it's kind of true. So it turns out that so there's an involvement in other fields. I started at Caltech on the faculty the same year that Kip did.
Okay, interesting.
And we became friendly very early. So he was in a different field than me. Obviously, he's a theorist. I'm an experimentalist in a totally different field. Fortunately, I had taken another side thing. I had taken, even though I didn't have to, general relativity as a graduate student. I had studied general relativity, and in some ways, I found it more palatable than quantum field theory.
Certainly, it's
because I could understand it a little bit better. I mean, I can manipulate the subscripts and superscripts and stuff, and it's not really as difficult as quantum physics, really.
Sure. It makes sense, unlike quantum mechanics. Yeah. Anyway.
So I took it in graduate school, and I knew it. So I was not uncomfortable with that, let's say, kind of physics side of it. Thinking about that field. And I was friendly with Kip, and then there was these. I really wasn't up on all the early searches, Weber's and all that very much, but I got interested once there was interferometry as a possible way to detect gravitational waves. This is long before I got involved. This is this was in the maybe 1980 or something like that.
When Weiss was.
Well, Caltech wasn't involved yet. And it was maybe late 70s or 1980. And when we were doing the annual thing of looking for new appointments, Kip was the first to say that we should build a group in the experimental part of looking for gravitational waves, not the theoretical part. And I got intrigued mostly. I never liked this idea of a bar. I mean, I knew about it, but I didn't like it because a bar rings at a certain frequency, and who says a gravitational wave is going to be at that frequency and it's not sensitive anywhere else? And so you need a broadband instrument. So I was critical of it from the very beginning as an instrument that was not matched to the problem. And so when interferometers were an idea, from the beginning, when they were talking about it, I was aware of that. And I was attracted to it because of its broadband ability. I had no idea how sensitive you could make it or this or that. But the fact that it could cover a broad band of frequencies and gravitational waves, depending on the source, might be at any frequencies that you could detect on the Earth.
Were you, let me just interrupt for a second. Way back earlier, were you interested? I've often wondered this because when we were in Scotland, I mean, there was a big, eventually a key work towards building what would eventually would be a gravitational wave detector was done by people in Scotland. Did you interact? Did you meet any of them at all then? No, okay. Sorry to interrupt, but I've always wondered.
So in 1980, I had a slight academic interest and enough to do some homework and support the idea that Kip had of developing an experimental group at Caltech with the next appointments we could make. So this was a dialogue that went on for 2 or 3 years. And then eventually we got, as a visitor and then a half-time appointment, Ron Drever from Glasgow.
Yeah.
And that group was built up. And I served at Caltech because there was quite a bit of involvement and bad history of false discoveries in that field. Caltech was pretty rigorous about making sure there was a lot of, and Kip was a theorist, that there was sufficient oversight. So we had a kind of tracking oversight group from the time the experimental effort started, which I served on. So I was part of recruiting Ron and then people after that. And I was on the oversight group, and I couldn't help but not learn all about interferometry and stuff in the process.
And I'm going to add a preface here from the viewpoint from outside. Gravitational waves, we realized that there was a way to possibly detect them. I figured there's no way in hell they'd ever be detectable. And there was a long history of wrong experiments and people trying to do stuff. And it seemed like from the outside, and there were theorists getting involved, and it was a lot of pie and stuff. And I was worried about money being wasted. I remember thinking about the NSF spending money and was it really worth it? And I remember thinking, well, okay, it's really good to try and get a real serious experimentalist in, who I trusted anyway, involved. And I knew you were beginning to get interested, and it was interesting to me to see what was happening. And that was in the early 1990s, or was that, I mean, you became involved directly in 1993, right? Yeah.
So the work at Caltech was maybe of any substance. It started in the early 80s, but mostly it was Kip and a couple of people, and mostly theoretical. But it got serious in about 1990. Of course, that's about the time that I got involved in the SSC. And I used to say that if I wasn't going to find the Higgs, I would look for gravitational waves during that period, because it was
it was the next
frontier. I was on this oversight thing and so forth. So, from my point of view, that part of it was easy. I mean, let's say it had the same kind of interests as things I liked, like looking for the, something that's important, an experimental challenge, something I kind of always.
Although it was a very different kind of experimental challenge. At least seemed to me, I was always amazed that you were able to go into it, because it seemed to me the relevant physics of the machines, of the detectors, very, very different.
So you said that a little bit of time passed. So what happened is in October of 93, Congress killed the SSC. And so many people and many scientists and technical people involved in the SSC went to CERN, a big part of our collaboration. Mm-hmm. And, we like to say that it changed the designs of those experiments and so forth. I never was attracted to do that. I always felt that those experiments were not going to be what I had been designing. The accelerator wasn't. Mm-hmm. And somehow stepping back to something that was not, if it failed, it was not what I didn't want to blame it on external things. And so I wasn't going to do that. And I was also extremely busy on a very thankless job. And that is, there were a lot of mostly, let's say, middle-aged scientists and technical people that I had been responsible for attracting to the SSC that were now out of jobs.
Yeah, it was terrible.
And so I was very busy helping. Some people managed to land or already went to CERN, but in the U.S. there was a big, really talented people, and some that were that I had talked out of, taking a job at the SSC that had been at Fermilab or SLAC or something.
No,
And
it was
so,
just.
I was doing this task, and then we also had to do something with quite a bit of equipment and so forth that we had had a surplus, but try to not just junk, but give it to the physics labs that could use it and so forth and so on. So I was busy with that for the period after October. In December, unbeknownst to me, I didn't know the politics at all. The NSF decided to, they hadn't funded LIGO yet, but they decided to give up on it unless Caltech changed, or Caltech and MIT changed the structure and management to something that they had been through a big review.
Sure, and I remember
a series of them, but they had failed. And so without going into that, the Caltech president, the MIT president, the head of the physics department at Caltech, Kip, all these people got together, I don't know, and they decided to ask me. Of course, I was available in principle. And so the head of the physics department at Caltech at that time was Charlie Peck, who was the first colleague that I met when I came and took a job at Caltech. Very first person, I didn't know anybody. So I had met him the first day I came. And he's dead now, but he actually is the one that they did their thing. I had nothing to do with it. And then he was to approach me. And so he called me. I was living in Santa Monica already.
Yeah.
And he called me and said he'd like to come out and take a walk on the beach with me. This is a guy I knew in my office and stuff. We didn't go out for drinks together. It just wasn't there.
Yeah.
And he would never venture out. I had no idea what this was about, except I thought something terrible was happening. So he came and brought me the message that the head of the NSF and the head of Caltech and MIT had wanted to ask me to take over LIGO. And
wow. And was it on the beach? Was it on the beach?
Yeah, walking on Santa Monica Beach.
I know your house right by
by our house. Where we live.
Yeah.
So down right here on the beach, and we were walking on the path. And so he asked me, and then
what do you think?
I didn't say no, but I didn't say yes either. What I did then was first I had a certain loyalty to Caltech and being in it.
Yeah.
So for me, I wasn't going to do it to save Caltech or MIT or this NSF project. I didn't really. I really wanted to assess two things. One is could you build something that had a reasonable chance of detecting gravitational waves? Of course, I'm willing to gamble some, as you know, looking for. So it just has to be, is it plausible or is it a stretch of your imagination in my mind? And the second, it was the technology, was the design and the capability there. Whether the team was good enough, I figured I'd redo all that anyway. So that didn't bother me. And then, but what had been proposed to the NSF in terms of resources, was that enough? So I spent the time between early December when I walked on the beach until I think it was February or March before I decided to do it. And during that time, I just studied all the questions I just posed.
And you convinced yourself it could work.
I convinced myself that it could work at the level that neutron star binary systems, which is not what we detected first, could be detected if the detections of neutron star binary systems in our own galaxy were reliable enough to make the predictions. There had only been a handful of binary systems, pulsars and binary systems seen in our own galaxy, but from that, you have to ask whether what had been seen is extrapolated properly to what exists in our own galaxy. and whether our galaxy is typical, because this is not, there's not enough of them in our galaxy to see.
Yeah, it's a big unknown. Yeah.
So you have to see out far enough to see them somewhere else. So how typical is our galaxy? And I looked at all that, and then the technologies and the level at which reasonable predictions was that the thing called the strain that you measure is 10 to the minus 21.
Which is, I mean, for people, I've talked about this publicly before, and so have you, but it means you're looking for changes in length by 1 part in 10 to the 21, which means you're looking at changes in a 3-kilometer long object that's smaller than 1/1000th of the size of a proton. It's a daunting challenge.
Yeah. So the first thing is you can't do it on a tabletop. You have to do it. So the reason it's kilometers is exactly what you said. So it's not 10 to the minus 21, it's 10 to the minus 18. Yeah. But that's still,
yeah.
So,
did you?
Can we make an instrument that can do that? And how good is the prediction? And the prediction, it turns out to be about right. We were lucky because that was not total luck though, but I mean, because you can predict them, but it's not surprising that's just because that was the one source we could estimate. I wanted something that we could estimate to give me a target that I could do, but I never thought that necessarily was going to be the first source we'd see.
Yeah, black holes were much more uncertain, but more visible, but much more uncertain. Black hole collisions, whereas neutron stars were more known and somewhat
exactly.
Small.
Neutron stars had been observed in our own galaxy. The black holes, there's almost no information from electromagnetic things, so we don't know.
Now, I'm only rushing because Simone is trying to drag you, because I would spend a little longer on this, but it seemed again from the outside like it was a boondoggle, like it wasn't that different than the space station in some sense. And so what was interesting to me was the decision, and now of course I come from particle physics, which has this effete attitude, but I remember learning from Jim Cronin, who you mentioned is a Nobel Prize winning physicist, a wonderful man and a great physicist. When he was looking at high energy cosmic rays, I remember him telling me the problem with the way these things were done, where they were hit and miss, people would build these little things. But the point was to build an experiment where if they were there, you'd find them. You take the particle physics approach, which is damn the torpedoes, build what's necessary to see the phenomena instead of eking here and eking there. Right. And I guess the sense I had when you began to take over LIGO was that it was that mentality. It's either build exactly. Sure, go on.
So that's why I said, so there was a reasonable target. The estimates could be off, but we can also make it better. So was that the limit of what we could make? No, but it was what we wanted to be funded to do, with the possibility that we could do better, which we're doing now. So I knew that we were not going to be limited. The Higgs, if it was smaller, you couldn't see it because it's a physics background, and it took a long time to build something up over a physics background. Gravitational waves, if we've detected them, the background and the difficulty doing it is technical, not physics.
Yeah.
So if we make the detector better, we can see rarer things. So I always knew we had a target that we designed to, but if they give us the money, we could make it better.
And you knew how to. I mean, and I would have bet $1 million that you'd never be able. I mean, it's still amazing to me that you could do it, and that's one of the reasons I'm a theorist. But I said, there's no way these guys are going to do it. But on the other hand, I guess I felt that if it was going to be done, your experience of building large object machines that were incredibly complicated to do a difficult task was the way it was going to be done. So I guess I knew in my own mind that I felt that if it was going to be successful, I mean, it was a new technology, and there are lots of people who develop technologies and deserve credit, but to make it happen is more than just physics. It's someone who can run a big enterprise, and that you had experience doing. So
since I have to go, can we end with me asking you a question related to this?
Yeah. Okay. I was going to ask you one too about what the future of the ILC are, but we can talk about it. You asked me.
All right.
Okay.
No. So one of the problems we made this observation, you recall, in September.
Yes.
And then we made an announcement in February. So we had months in between.
You want to ask me about my leak?
For us, there's a good reason why we took the time we took.
Sure.
The first was, whether what we saw was right or we were fooling ourselves or being fooled. And that took a while. And then the second that took us some time is if we were really seeing something, we wanted to have the pleasure, I wanted to especially, of understanding what it was on our own.
Sure.
And it's hard with Einstein's equations and so forth to fit and get parameters and stuff. Before we just release some observation, those wiggles, and let other people do it. And so, writing an article and so forth. And of course, keeping privacy when you have 1,000 collaborators is a difficult thing. But during that period, you were one of the people who spread rumors that we were saying.
I was the one. I'm the culprit. But let me give you my side of the story, okay? And I think I did you an immense favor, and I've convinced Kip of this fact. Okay. First of all, I've known experiments that have been about to announce big results, and collaborators have told me the result and said, "Don't say anything." And I've never violated that. I've never violated. I remember with the original inflationary gravitational waves, I was let in on because they asked me to write a companion article, but never talked about it. There were rumors in the scientific community about a potential thing, and I also felt if you have social media and there are rumors, then as long as you express that it's a rumor, why should it just be scientists who are getting excited about it? Why not get the public? So I had no problem with that. I was told by two people individually over a 2-month period, neither of who had any relationship with the experiment. None of them were on the experiment. And they told me about a result, and it seemed to be clear. And my feeling was, well, if that's the case, I'm not violating anything by talking to anyone who's ever been in the experiment. And moreover, even though I know it caused incredible hassle because then the journalists started bugging people when you were trying to do other work, what it did do, in my experience in popularization of science, is journalists have like one day to explain a scientific result. They take the press release and they just do. And what this gave was 1,000 journalists around the world a month or 2 months time to prepare to write incredibly comprehensive and good articles. And so I have no hesitation. I just explained to the public that the scientific community was interested. I didn't violate any confidence of anyone in the result. And I think I feel it was the right thing to do. And even though I knew it caused a hassle.
Yeah, no, I'm not attacking it.
No, but I'm defending.
My fear was that the actual result, what we saw, would come out early. A rumor that we saw something didn't matter.
Exactly. Yeah, that's my feeling actually. And I figured I also wasn't worried about stealing your thunder, because saying that there's a rumor is not the same as saying here's what they saw.
Yeah, no, but if we start having to defend the specific result because it got out, that's what I didn't want.
Oh yeah. And that would have been awful. And it was wonderful that in my mind, it worked the best possible way because people were primed. And
the rumors never had any specificity that we then had to respond to. So it didn't.
It was perfect. Hi, and welcome back to the Origins Podcast. I'm Lawrence Krauss, your host. This is part 2 of my discussion with Barry Barish. As I mentioned in my earlier introduction, we met again to complete a discussion of the present and future, and that discussion became very wide-ranging. And so we made it into a second part of this podcast. And it's fascinating because we talked about the really challenges of the LIGO discovery itself, and then the future of gravitational waves. And then, in a complementary sense, another aspect of what Barry's been working on is the future of particle physics. So it gives a sense of the thrill and challenge of discovery and the possibilities of future discoveries. So I hope you enjoy part 2. Take care. Thanks, Barry, for coming back. We had to quit a little suddenly, and there are a few issues I just wanted to cover with you. And so I really appreciate your indulgence to come back and spend a little more time talking.
Happy to have a second chance.
Yeah, it's nice, always nice to talk. And I want to mostly talk about the future, but I do want to hit on some things. We hit on LIGO very quickly, and you talked about how you basically made that decision to take the job on over 3 months when you were sort of looking at it and deciding if it was doable. What convinced you that it was doable? Do you remember what was the it was new technology for you, right? I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but you probably had to bring yourself up to speed on the technology itself, right? First.
I did, but I think you can. In this particular experiment, I looked at two things. I think one is the technology realizable that's being proposed? To what extent is it a dream, and people are extrapolating? They can do better, and to what extent have things been proven? And so we came to the strategy to do this in 2 steps. So that's where the name Advanced LIGO came from.
Sure.
And so we called it LIGO 1 and LIGO 2. LIGO 1 using technologies that we had tested one way or the other, not a long scale, but test interferometers. And in the lab, or were known to be technologies that worked. We weren't extrapolating. And that was pushed to the level where it was, the words I used at the NSF, at the National Science Board, when they were evaluating us, was that detections were possible. Meaning it was at a level where we weren't breaking any physical laws and where you could plausibly imagine sources that were strong enough. Okay. But I think, as I said last time, we used as a target, because we could calculate it, neutron star binaries.
Yeah, you did mention that.
And there were a handful that had been seen in our own galaxy. And so with that, you can extrapolate how many, not systematically, of course, they were just discovered when you looked at pulsars. So extrapolating how many there are in our galaxy had a big error on it, but within that error. And then the second question is, we're not going to see it in our own galaxy. We're going to have to see it in some galaxies further out to get enough rate. How typical is our galaxy compared to other galaxies for binary pulsars? Okay, with that in mind, there's a pretty big range of sensitivities that you might need or have, and what we did is more or less target the central value, and that's where the 10 to the minus 21 comes from. So the 10 to the minus 21 was the central kind of calculated value using the binaries that had been seen in our own galaxy. And that was not attainable with the initial version of LIGO. We knew we had to improve a whole bunch of things, but hadn't done the technologies to do that. So we said we wanted to do LIGO in 2 steps. LIGO 1, where detections were possible, and LIGO 2, where detections were probable. Okay, that was the words I used with the National Science Board.
And that was your strategy? Did you, let me ask you.
Yeah, that was my strategy. And they bought off on that, but asked us to change the names. They didn't like the idea of anything being called LIGO 2 when we were just being approved for LIGO 1.
Yeah.
Which made it sound like there's going to be a LIGO 3 and 4. And so they asked us to change the name. So we called it Initial LIGO and Advanced LIGO. So that's where the name Advanced LIGO came from.
Oh, okay. So they came up with it.
Now we're doing something which you'll see around called A+. And what that is going beyond Advanced LIGO. So we're doing some things that'll give us another factor or 2 or so.
Another factor. Well, I was going to ask about the future. But before I get to the future, the one other thing I wanted to ask was, what was the biggest single challenge that you think of, either in LIGO or Advanced LIGO, maybe in each? In LIGO, what was what you thought the biggest challenge would be, and was it what it turned out to be? Experimentally.
That's a very good question. But first, I'll say the biggest challenge in anything like this is the human challenge. It's not the technical challenge. I mean, this was holding a group with a needed expertise together for 20 years or so. is the biggest challenge. So the
Sure.
human challenge, I'd say, is the biggest one. I think you're referring to the technical challenges.
But let me, before we get to the technical challenge, I think, I mean, you won't say this, but be fair to you, there were a number of reasons that LIGO happened because of your participation in it. But I think you would say that your experience on large-scale particle physics experiments served you in good stead in terms of that human challenge, I assume, right? I mean, that was really important.
Yeah. I think I had a lot of experience knowing what people of different expertise, different reasons they're in something. I had a fair amount of experience, and on a scale that's large enough where everybody doesn't know everything and so forth. So this was, a long time scale and maybe more varied in terms of the type of expertise that people had in the collaboration than in particle physics.
Sure.
I mean, this varies from even on the theoretical side, from astronomers to kind of fundamental physicists to general relativists kind of.
To atomic physicists and
And then on the experimental side, there's precision engineering, and there's a lot of we push the technology, say, for lasers. So that's a speciality. The people who know the best and most about lasers aren't really physicists that want to search for gravitational waves necessarily, except the romance. And so putting that whole group together and making it sing, if you want, not be disparate parts, was, I'd say, the biggest challenge. And, for the most part, we succeeded.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so that was the human challenge, but now let's say the experimental challenge. What did you expect, and was it what turned out to be the challenge?
Yeah. First, I am a bit of an optimist. I thought we would see gravitational waves with initial LIGO, or what we call enhanced LIGO, which is putting a little bit beyond that in.
It's always good to be optimistic to keep yourself going.
Well, I was optimistic in a way that turns out to be true, which is that the strongest source wasn't neutron star binaries. So I didn't think that we would necessarily reach the most extreme projections you'd make of that, but that something else would be seen first. And something else was first, and you couldn't predict its rate. So I was optimistic that we would do it. When we didn't quite reach it, we did something we called enhanced LIGO, which was a cheat to kind of put some of the already by that time developed advanced LIGO into initial LIGO and have one more run before we took 4 years to build an upgraded detector. The main challenge, I think, was isolating from the Earth, a mundane technical challenge. And that is the two challenges for LIGO, if you want to put it in a thumbnail, are to do interferometry itself much, much better than people have done before. If you go into a freshman or sophomore laboratory, you see fringes and some interferometer that they make you do, and you can probably do 1 part in 10 or 1 part in 20 or something. Split a fringe is the word that you might remember gets used. And high-level interferometers that are used in laboratories or in equipment might be 10 times better than that. So people had done interferometry at the level of 10 to the 3 or 10 to the 4. We had to do it to split a fringe to 1 part in 10 to the 12 to get to the 10 to the minus 20.
So that's 100 million times improvement.
Yeah. Now, basically, much of that comes with brute force. Brute force meaning a powerful laser, we use Fabry-Perot arms, which bounce the beam back and forth and get more power even than the lasers. There's tens of bounces. And so brute force is part of it. Brute force also making the arms long. But the rest of it was innovations in interferometry. Much of those innovations were on the table by the time I came into this, and it's the reason I could see that we could do it. They weren't all proven in the lab, and some of them couldn't be proven on smaller scales. But there was a 40-meter interferometer at Caltech and a 30-meter that had existed in Germany before that did a lot of the work. Of course, 40 meters is a factor of 100 less than we build. There's a rule of thumb that you never extrapolate more than a factor. You like to do experimentally a factor of 2. You're semi-crazy when you do a factor of 100. And we were doing a factor of 10, and we were doing, a factor of
100, which did seem crazy to me. That's one of the things that seemed crazy in advance.
But that's the interferometry itself.
Yeah.
The second was what seems like a mundane technical problem, but it's really tough. And it's the one that in advanced LIGO enabled the discovery. And that is what we did in LIGO. Well, what we have to do is to isolate LIGO from the ground. Here we're on the Earth, but we can't have the Earth shake so much that you can't do interferometry at this level. It's impossible. So you have to basically isolate it from the Earth in the frequency bands that we worry about. So we're in the frequency band. We have nothing to do with audio, but the place where the Earth is the quietest is the audio band, 10 to 10,000 hertz, basically. Yeah. If you go below that, the Earth shakes like crazy. If you go above that, it's almost impossible to work because you're at such high frequencies. So our ears have figured out by evolution where you can make them work to communicate with each other. And that's from tens of hertz to thousands of hertz or 10,000 hertz. So that's the laboratory that's available on the Earth. But the Earth shakes much too much to do interferometry at the level that we're talking about.
Yeah, no, I used to say, sorry, go on.
Yeah. Go ahead, say.
Well, I when I was lecturing on this early or later, I can't remember. I used to say, I made it up, but I don't know. I used to say that if a truck 20 miles away hit a bump and you didn't isolate from it, it would produce a signal much bigger than the signal you were looking for.
That's the problem. So in fact, like the first problem we had in Louisiana on initial LIGO, not advanced LIGO, was that LIGO's in a commercial pine forest. And so they come around with these big yellow things and chop down trees, and then that part of the forest regrows in 20 years, and they rotate around this big forest. And the trees falling, even though they weren't anywhere where we could see them, but they're somewhere on this land, would knock the interferometer out of operation. So your little story is essentially right. So we had to isolate ourselves from the Earth. The technologies are really mundane. What we did for initial LIGO was basically do something. I don't know. I can't remember if we talked about my childhood last time.
We did, and I was going to say the big problem.
So I told you my first job was aligning tires and wheels.
Yeah.
Okay. So one thing I understood very well, because I went to the library when I was 14 or 15, is shock absorbers, how they work. Okay. The shock absorbers in your car. So a shock absorber in your car, if you didn't have them, the ride would be pretty bad. Yeah. But instead, you go over a bump and it's pretty damn smooth. You can barely tell you've done it, unless it's bumps to keep you from going fast down a road in Santa Monica would try to keep you. So anyway, the way that's done is to basically take and absorb the high frequency shock. You can't get rid of the energy, of course. And so it gets transferred to lower energy. And that's what a shock absorber does. It basically moves the shock, which would make us bump up and down in the car, and moves it to lower energy. So all we really did is take this mundane technology that I knew as a kid and make the best shock absorbers that ever existed. Okay, that is just the right squishiness. So they were made like shock absorbers in cars don't look this way, but they're made by like springs and hollow springs. And inside the spring, we put some goop but that made it just the right squishiness. So the materials in the goop made it just the right squishiness. But we couldn't isolate ourselves well enough from the Earth to get to the level where we detected gravitational waves. And especially this is really a problem at low frequencies. So it turns out the shaking of the Earth falls off. I don't know why, you might know why, like frequency to the 4th power. That's fast.
Yeah,
so,
that's fast. Okay.
So
that's a good problem to think about.
Yeah. So our ears cut off at 10 hertz. And if you go just a little bit below that, it's really noisy. The Earth is moving around and shaking and making noise. And so our ears have learned to, keep the noise away, and they cut off there. But the problem trying to do it in these springs is the final, even though we get rid of it, it's still, we're getting rid of something that's falling like frequency to the 4th power. So by not having a good enough
shock absorber, I guess, or spring.
Shock absorber, good enough shock absorber. It basically means that we're not as good at low frequency as we might be. And at the higher frequencies, we weren't down to the 10 to the minus 21 yet. Okay, that was advanced LIGO. Yeah. So the reason we didn't make detections in initial LIGO was a combination of, but primarily because of cutoff at low frequencies. And we weren't good enough yet to do neutron stars at higher energy, because the detections we made, which were black hole mergers that were heavier than neutron stars, don't go to high frequency. So the whole detection, the reason it only makes a few wiggles in our detector is it barely gets up to the frequencies that can be detected in our detector. And by 100 hertz, there's no signal. They're gone. I mean, they merge together. So we needed to make better seismic isolation. We did as good as I could imagine doing passively. We made these great squishy things. We made 4 very independent layers. So it got by the first one, got screened by the second, third, and fourth. You probably know that LIGO is on a pendulum.
Yeah.
Okay, that's part of the same reason. It's a suspended mass. And if you hold a pendulum, like this, and you move the top, it doesn't do much to the bottom. Yeah. Right? I can't go like that. It doesn't do much. Yeah. So the combination of a pendulum, which kind of eliminates sideways motions, and shock absorbers, which get rid of the vertical motions, you design a little more complicated than that. But that basically enables us to get things down, but that wasn't down far enough. So we just had taken the mundane shock absorbers from a car and made a little better ones. And that was, but we didn't detect gravitational waves. That's up to 2009 or 2010 or so. And so we had to add something else. And that was, again, stealing another good idea, which instead of inventing one, which is, you take airplanes all over the place, and you probably own a pair of Bose earphones that you use on an airplane. So what does that do? That actually senses the ambient noise from the engines on the airplane and cancels it. And that's different than the frequency things when a stewardess comes around and asks you if you want coffee, tea, or a drink or something. You hear her, but you don't hear the engines anymore. So it's like magic. It works very well.
It's amazing.
So basically, we wanted to basically use the same idea, get rid of the residual ambient motion. So what that involved is burying inside of this big seismic, passive seismic system like your car, but fancier, a whole array of seismometers pointing in all directions. Our problem is harder than the one in the plane because there you don't care about direction. But we have to not only see that there's some motion getting by our passive system, but what direction it's going. And then we push against it. So we basically have this array of sensors, seismic sensors.
Yeah.
And when it senses something, we then push against it. And that gave us another factor of 100 or so.
Which is what you needed.
The final isolation from the Earth is the same factor, another factor of 10 to the 12th. So to do LIGO, you just have to do a factor of 10 to the 12th twice. Once in interferometry, do interferometry at the level of one part in 10 to the 12th of the wavelength of the light you're using, and isolate yourself from the ground. Pretty mundane problem, but it's a technical one. Both those are just technical. They're not limited by physics.
Yeah.
And 1 part in 10 to the 12th.
So yes, 2 parts, 2 times 10 to the 12th. That's why I would have looked at it in 2000. I would have said, "Good luck, guys." And but I will say one thing that makes me feel good.
Except both of them, I always worried more about the Higgs, because the difference between our discovery and the Higgs, and the difference between what's happened afterwards, is a result of the fact that in the case of the Higgs, the background is physics. Yeah. And it's there. The Higgs is a 1 or 2% thing on top of that. So you can see, if you do well enough and get enough data, you can see this little thing statistically, and then it's hard to go beyond that. It's still a 2% effect on top of a huge background. Well, in our case, the background is technical, so we can keep improving it. It's just a question of how good we are, if we can improve it. And
how good you are, how much patience you are, and
it's much easier to have the patience now. I mean, once you made the discovery,
then there's motivation. Yeah.
So each step now we take 6 months. In fact, we'd like to be off more. Trouble is, people have this mentality that. So we have a huge amount of pressure from the community and from the NSF to run all the time.
Yeah, which is I'd be hard for an experiment.
These events, but we're better off if we spend 3/4 of our time improving the damn thing, because we gain so fast. If we get a factor of 2 sensitivity, it means we look out a factor of 2 further.
And then you have 8 times more events.
Yeah. So there's a huge payoff, and it's not like the Higgs, where you keep running and running and running and running and running to get enough statistics. In our case, you want sensitivity.
Yeah, not statistics. Well, that's amazing. There are 2 things that are interesting about it. One is, one, I thought it was interesting, and you already said it, but I thought it was interesting that the big problem harkened back to what you studied in the library when you were 14, which I thought was hysterical. The other was, I'm happy about this, by the way, because I always thought the big problem would be seismic isolation. That was my gut feeling. So it makes me feel better to know that my gut feeling. But you're right. Once you have a discovery, it's amazing. I've realized this as a theorist too. It's an interesting fact about discoveries in physics. You take things more seriously once you've discovered them. So I've been a theorist and I've written papers that I could have written before the discovery of something, but never thought seriously enough about it. And you get just so motivated. And, another example in astrophysics is the cosmic microwave background, which is another, a Nobel Prize winning discovery. And the fluctuations in it, they were so close, but no one really believed they were there. But within a short time after the Colby experiment first saw them, all these ground-based experiments basically had sort of almost seen it, but just discounted it, suddenly could look for it. It's really amazing what a discovery does and how it changes.
It does. It really does.
Yeah.
For an experimentalist, it actually, the other side of the coin is I spent 20 years since 1994, 1990, more than 20.
Yeah.
22 years before we made the discovery on this project. So it's natural that people, when they interview me, ask me, did you lose? Did you think it was going to fail at some time or get disgusted or this or that? And the answer is that somehow, as an experimentalist, there's a lot I'll misuse the word, that's fun. It's just fun to solve all these problems.
I remember you telling me that when I was a graduate student, that you liked the fact that one day you could be thinking about this and another day you could be thinking about that. And if you got tired of thinking about this, there's all these problems.
Yeah, it goes back to, as a kid fixing a car. Yeah. There's a great satisfaction. I didn't make custom cars or anything, but there's a great satisfaction in making my old jalopy work better. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and you know, and again, to be fair, as a theorist, I think it's good we're having this discussion. I often tell people, you know, who criticize, you know, take string theory, for example. Okay, it hasn't, you know, said anything about the real world yet, and people say, well, you know, doesn't that, you know, but these people believe that it will, and I say, well, sure, if you're going to spend 10 or 20 years as a theorist, you know, tackling this complex problem, you got to have some initial, you know, optimism, and at the same time have fun along the way, solving little problems.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You have to have fun along the way. I mean, you know, compared to a lot of professions or whatever, as physicists, we have more patience probably than.
Yeah, well, some of us do. I'm not very patient myself.
Well, I don't know if you need instant gratification, but you know, it's a problem my wife deals with all the time. So we don't need it quite much, but we do need it, and so
yeah, you do need it, and you have to be.
And as an experimentalist, you have to to be a successful one. I think you have to get an enjoyment out of solving a lot of challenging but little problems. It's just fun to do.
It's little problems, and also accepting that things don't work. I mean, you know, as a theorist, you know, I've written many papers and they're wrong, but not because they were wrong, but nature just decided not to. You know, if everything you did was right, it wouldn't be, you know, it wouldn't be, anyone could do it, I guess. So it's a combination of lots of things. As you know, it is interesting, and personalities. I think I said this at the beginning of our discussion, but I tend to. There's some theorists I know who tend to work on the same problem for 20 years, and that's not a bad thing. I mean, some have made big strides, but they focus on it. And I tend to be, I like to sort of hit and run a little bit. I like to work on lots of different kinds of physics and look for something and learn something new, and then do something, and I don't have the patience sort of to, once I've sort of proposed a new thing, I like to move on to something else. And anyway, it's just me. But anyway. Yeah.
Well, I'm more like you than most experimentalists stay in the same field and get better and better.
And you certainly.
I mean, part of it, you focused on, you know, am I afraid of new technologies or the different things? I think once you're a good experimentalist, that's not a big issue. But changing always is learning's fun.
Learning, and it's invigorating. It's invigorating. Well, look, okay. So last thing on LIGO, and then I want to move to the future particle physics, and then we'll be almost done. Is what's next for LIGO? So you told me A+.
Yeah. So I think the big deal is that you gain. There's two things. If we look at the future, one is we're not limited by physics, we're limited by technology, so you can do better. And there's, I think, strong reason to do better, and that isn't collecting statistics. Right now, we see one. We're now seeing one. When we turned off for the pandemic last March, in that run we were seeing one merger a week. When we turned back on in what was supposed to be a 15-month break, but it's going to end up being 30 because of the pandemic, just the distancing problem, working on close optics and stuff is making us that. We'll be seeing one a day. Okay. Wow. That's not the right figure of merit. Yeah. To me, okay. But what matters to us more is looking further out and looking at basically getting to some finite redshift. Because for me, I think the future, other than trying to understand where these black holes come from and blah, blah, which is related, is to start getting in the region where you can do cosmology with gravitational waves. To me, that's the great future, other than picking maybe some single problems. But it's the great future as a field.
Sure.
Can you get to where you're not doing astrophysics with gravitational waves, which is great, but can we start doing cosmology where you don't have this 300,000 year barrier that you do with electromagnetic? You don't have the rate problem that exists with neutrinos. So in principle, you can see back to the very first instance of the Big Bang. And whether that's doing it directly by seeing those stochastic signals or seeing the equivalent of the cosmic microwave background for gravitational waves. Anyway, the long-term, I think, future that excites me, although it's past my active time, is to get to where you can do cosmology, start to do cosmology with gravitational waves. So we can talk about what things in detail, but that's okay. So to do that, it's not, we have to go beyond an incremental steps on the LIGO we have now, where we get factors of 2 every 5 years by fixing some of the technological limitations. We need a new detector. So so the future is a new detectors. The concept for it is not agreed upon yet. I mean, it's interferometry, but we don't have something better. Some people look at atomic interferometry, but it's not realistic at this point. I'm not sure it ever will be. So it's interferometry, but basically beyond what we can do on the present systems. So the Europeans have done a rather extensive job of designing a next generation experiment that they call the Einstein telescope. And I'm worried is too expensive, but nevertheless, it's a concept. It's got the following features. You go deep underground. It gets rid of the seismic noise to a large extent and other things that happen on the Earth's surface. They're deeper than LHC, 300 meters down, where anything from the surface doesn't propagate, basically. There's 2 sites that they talk about that they're looking at, one in Holland and one in Sardinia, both 300 meters, more or less, underneath the ground. And under the ground at that depth, and they've designed kind of the fanciest interferometer system you can imagine, a triangle and like the one in space instead of, which gives you redundancies, and the light can go around both ways, clockwise and counterclockwise, at 10 kilometers on the side. And technically the biggest improvement you can make, single improvement, which we could try to do on the present LIGO, but there's too much involved, I think, to waste it on that, and that is to go cryogenic. So we're presently limited by the fact that we're at room temperature, and the mirrors themselves have KT noise, Brownian motion, so forth. You want to cool it. Cooling it means you have to cool it without shaking it at all. That's hard technically. But you have to also change all the materials. The same material we use for mirrors on the surface is no good at low temperature. You have to use different materials. What temperature do you go to? What's the coating you use to make it a mirror, and so forth. So we're working on those R&D, and the simplest solution without any R&D is to go to very low temperature, which we're trying not to do in our design, but the Europeans.
Well, you're probably lucky too. I mean, everyone I know works at very low temperature. It's different. There's a host of new problems. Working at room temperature is a luxury, I suppose, at some level.
Well, room temperature is a luxury. As hard as LIGO is, but the European design goes to low temperature at present and uses sapphire for the material for the mirrors. We presently use silicon, fused silicon, and they don't know what the coating is. We're looking at somewhat higher temperatures, not quite so cold, where we can use maybe crystalline silicon.
Will there be, I mean, when you say will there be, again, will there be 2? Will there be a European and an American, or is it just too expensive?
So we don't know. So right now, it's healthy right now because nobody's going to fund it today, and we don't know what to build quite. So there's a plan in Europe to build, which is further along. The reason is there was a lot of money available through the European Union or EC, I don't know, for R&D over the past decade. And so between 2005 and 2011 or so, they did this design in Europe. They've refined it since then. We weren't allowed to do anything visible that went beyond advanced LIGO by the NSF. If we even smelled that we were using somebody to do something, they'd want to take away our money in the lab. And the idea was okay. You promised you're going to build this thing and make it work and detect gravitational waves, or try to. And here you're spending your effort designing yet another one. So we couldn't do anything until we detected gravitational waves. So we have a much later start than the Europeans because we weren't allowed. But we're looking at something where we can make several. The idea is to not make something so expensive and deep underground as the Europeans are talking about, but rather something that's more of a cookie cutter kind of design, something you can duplicate. So we can have several around the world to be able to point like we do now.
What kind of time?
So we're talking about 40 kilometers instead of 4 kilometers.
Wow.
On the Earth's surface, but cryogenic, and with all the modern technologies that we're not, putting into LIGO itself, or we hope not to put in. And there we can, for black hole, for these black hole binaries, we can go back all the way to the edge of the universe.
Wow.
We think with that kind of design, not quite so far with neutron merger and star mergers, but anyway, we can get into the cosmological region.
Yeah, where you can measure redshift factors and all sorts of other things, and distance redshift, measure the Hubble constant. So, what kind of time frame are we talking about?
What we'd like, and I think would be possible if it was technically driven, is to be contemporaneous with the space experiment. I mean, there's good reason to try to be working at the same time, and those have finite lifetimes. So the lease of the space experiment is presently scheduled for 2034. So we're talking about the mid-2030s, which means we'd have to start building at 2025 or so. So the work now is preliminary to us really going with a proposal.
Wow. Okay.
The idea would be to go with a proposal and in 2025 or so to probably both the NSF and DOE to do it jointly at that stage.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I look forward to our discussion in the 2030s about.
Right. And fortunately, there's people like me and Ray and a few others that can afford to spend their time doing that now, because otherwise everybody wants to exploit what we've got. Of course.
Sure. Yeah. And you can spend the time thinking about the future. Yeah. Which is great. I mean, it's a wonder, and it takes all kinds to do science well. Yeah. So I think it's just great. But you've always thought about the future. Now, speaking of the future, while during LIGO, you weren't exactly resting on either your laurels or on the challenges of LIGO. You also headed, if I'm right, in your home territory, the particle physics research on what many people thought might be, and still think might be the future of accelerators and something called the International Linear Collider. So I think was that begin around 2004 or 2003 or something that we began to work on that? Well,
what happened, I mean, I backed into it. First, I have a background in accelerators, which I think I told
you mentioned. Very few particle physicists do. That's right.
Yeah, so I'm even in the accelerator division of the APS, and so I'm unusual in that I've worked on accelerators from the beginning. So I'm in that community as a practicing experimentalist. The problem is, particle accelerators have one variable, go to higher energy.
Yeah.
We've had for 50 years or so a wonderful synergy between using electrons and positrons and using protons and protons, hadron collisions, and how we have seen particle physics advance. The proton machines are easier and give you a good picture, but very difficult to do any precision measurements because they're not very selective in what they pick up. An example is the Higgs, I'll come to, but I mentioned it's only a 1% effect.
Yeah.
So the electron-positron machines have played a big role, but they've gotten harder to do because electrons are so light that you lose by the fact that when they go around a circle, they radiate away their energy. And so it's really hard to make a next generation equivalent of LHC with electrons. It's just a really tough problem because the electrons radiate away their energy. So in order to go to the next generation, you need to get around that problem. If you wanted to do electrons and positrons, I'll give you the motivation in a minute. And that means you have to go to not bending them, because these accelerations is what makes them radiate away by synchrotron radiation, all their energy that you put into it. So you need a straight line. That means that's where the idea of having a linear collider comes. Of course, the problem with it, one of the problems with it, but the most obvious one, is then these two rifles are shooting a bullet at each other, and they get one chance to hit each other, and then it's gone. In a particle accelerator like CERN, these two beams go counterclockwise and clockwise, and if they don't intersect the first time around, they get the second and third and nth, so forth, and you keep focusing them, and you use the particles going around over and over again. So an electron machine has to be so good that you can do it on one pass, and somehow also then get rid of the beams and stuff, which is a technical problem on one pass. And this requires doing a kind of machine that no one's ever done before. And you're doing it as the nth generation accelerator. So it's a tough challenge. I mean, LIGO is a tough challenge, but this is in the sense that we didn't use linear colliders at lower energy. I mean, there was a fake one at SLAC.
Yeah, it was a fake one at SLAC.
It wasn't a linear collider.
Yeah.
So it was a hard problem. They were working on the technologies to do that in R&D, much like before I was in LIGO, at three places, at SLAC, at KEK Lab in Japan, and at the DESI laboratory in Hamburg, Germany. And during the 1990s, they did this. If you had asked me if we were doing this interview sometime in the 1990s, probably as late as the late 1990s, and you asked me what I thought about this when it was being done in these labs, I probably would have said it's a great idea, but it's too hard. A little bit like what you said about gravitational waves. But the R&D, those labs are really good, and they have really good people. And the R&D that was done at SLAC and KK and Germany not only more or less demonstrated in principle the feasibility by about the year 2000, but too many riches. There were two different schemes that both basically proved themselves. One was to do it at room temperature on something like the SLAC accelerator, and the other was to make a superconducting version, which is it sounds like it's just cold versus warm, but it is just quite different. The whole scheme by which you make superconducting cavities to accelerate is a different concept. And so by the year 2000, it was possible. Before that, so this is a little bit like LIGO. It was successful R&D to prove feasibility that you could do such a machine. In about the year 2000 or 2001, I led the high energy physics long range planning that I do every few years with John Bagger from
Johns
Hopkins. And he was the theorist, I was the experimentalist, and we did this study of the future for DOE of high energy physics. And the number one recommendation we made was build a linear collider. Okay, I was busy doing LIGO, of course. We were just commissioning LIGO, so it wasn't for me, but I had done, just to say that I knew the background, I knew the R&D, I knew accelerator physics. I had studied the physics potential, which I'll come to in a minute. And then, interestingly, the worldwide community, which is done through an organization called ICFA, International Committee for Future Accelerators, which has more or less the lab directors of the big labs.
Yeah.
They meet now and then. They decided the next machine should be a linear collider. This is 2000, or probably should be. And they commissioned a big study to decide whether, if they pursue it, it should be a superconducting accelerator or a room temperature accelerator. Why did they have to make the choice then? Because the R&D at this stage, the concept had been done, but now you had to build real prototypes that were some size. The technologies are completely different. The cost for doing R&D for something like this is very, very expensive.
Yeah.
So it's essential to do a decision. Do you build a machine that's room temperature? Do you do a machine that's cold? That followed the study that Bagger and I did in the ICFA priorities. So they put together a committee in the way that experimental physicists like to do it, find the experts in the world and put them together to make this decision. You really want a technical decision to be made by technical experts, not by others. And so they put together a committee, and it included a lot of the principals who had worked on these technologies at SLAC or Berkeley and DESI and some other places, but put them all together. They ended up writing, it met kind of twice, and two times they did the study. They ended up writing a big, long report, 600 pages, which tells you something already.
Yeah.
Okay, something bad.
Yeah, that's right.
600 pages. They were put together to make a decision. And it was, being 600 pages, I didn't even look at it. I was making LIGO work, so I was pretty much not looking at it at all. They convened the committee a second time because this 600-page report didn't really make a choice. So they tried to make them make a choice. Well, they had people on both sides. They didn't make a choice. So this is when I got myself involved. I got approached by Jonathan Dorfan, who was the head of ICFA at that time, and to make a new committee, which is not the kind of committee that I think should do it. They weren't all experts, but were people who knew something and had their heads screwed on right. To decide between the two technologies. And I was chair of that. And they gave us a year to decide. And we had a pretty intense time where we decided in 6 months. And well, I wanted to get back to LIGO. And I was to this. We were making LIGO work. And we decided in 6 months that the best choice, and it wasn't easy actually, was to use the more modern technology, which is to be superconducting. There's a lot of reasons why, but I would say the two most important weren't that one would perform better than the other in an initial version of linear collider, but that there was much more future in a superconducting machine and more other uses. So rather than just be for high energy physics, we were developing something that could be used for making pharmaceuticals and all kinds of things that need particle accelerators. So, so we decided on cold technology, and I went back to LIGO, and that was all fine. And then they had they had a process which I don't know, but they a year or two later they came back and asked me if I would I would run this thing. And it just happened to be okay for me because it was the time we had proposed and gotten conceptual approval for advanced LIGO, but we had to wait in a queue to get funded for for a few years, and then we would start the building. So I felt I had a roughly 4 or 5 year period that I could do this. So that was basically the rationale. And then they wanted to do it all like the central design had been done for the Super Collider, where it was done in Berkeley by Maury Tigner. And this was going to be done in Vancouver. I didn't want to move to Vancouver, although I like it very much as a place. But it wasn't that. It wasn't, or moving Simone, it wasn't that. It was because to do this, I thought it was such a hard problem, in many ways harder than LIGO. I needed to do what I had done in LIGO, which is to bring absolutely the best experts in all the areas together to work on it. And you're not going to get them all to move to Vancouver, even for 3 years. So it had to be done from a distance, and I had to jump around the world to do it. But for example, I just, the expertise on positrons, which you have to do over electrons and positrons, existed in France and in Germany, and not so much in the US and so forth. And so basically where was the expertise was the real problem for me. And we put together a really strong group of accelerator people, but it was finite, and we worked from a distance, and had meetings twice a year where we got together, but otherwise I traveled around like crazy. And we did the design. So the design passed all the hurdles it was done by 2011 or so, and then they made us go through the usual review after review after review after review from outsiders to make sure they validated it, and they did. And then at that point, it was 2012, I said goodbye and went back, which was always my plan, went back to LIGO, and they replaced me with Lynn Evans. Lynn Evans is the guy who built the LHC.
Yeah, I know him.
Yeah. And so they replaced me with somebody who was better, and that's good. So he came in. He had been serving as chair of the technical committee that was evaluating us along the way. So I'd gotten to know him pretty well. And he was, as an outsider, as up to speed as you could be, and of course had all the right background.
Yeah.
So he came in, and at that point, the Japanese looked like they were going to make a decision quickly. They still haven't, as of today. So it's 8 years later. So you can ask me whether it should still be done, or where it stands now. I can't judge the politics. I really can't. I've learned that trying to judge Japanese politics or anything is really difficult. You can't.
Is it clear that if it'll be done in Japan, or?
I think if it's done at all, it'll be done in Japan.
And the cost of it'll be about?
They'll make a reduced version at the beginning that'll do the Higgs, but not go to half a TeV, where you can do the self-coupling, for example, of the Higgs. So it'll be a Higgs factory as the first stage, and be roughly, I would say, 5 billion.
And then the
whole
ultimate
shebang, as we proposed it, was more like 10, which is the cost of the LHC.
Which costs the LHC. I mean, 10. I tend to think it was 10 billion as a quanta now for a new.
And you can just say how big is it? How many pieces are there? And this and that. And it's the same as it's the same as the LHC. It's not as big, and well, it is when you take the length and stuff. But if you just take all the number of parts and things, it makes sense. And if you add it up in detail, it comes out about that. So to build a machine like that, it's about $10 billion. It's presently in the Japanese system. The Japanese are impossible to read, but they have agreed in principle to make the next step, which is to form what they call a pre-lab. So it's not a lab yet. It's in Japan, but they are wanting more assurances of international participation.
Well, that's the next thing I was going to ask. I mean, this is so expensive. It will be internet. There will require international cooperation, funding, not just scientifically, but funding wise.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be done. Maybe not like CERN, which is a huge, treaty-based organization with a certain amount contributed, but it'll have major contribution from the U.S. and from Europe, and then some from others. And
and then, sorry, go on.
And that, isn't in the bag yet. So where it stands today is the U.S. is pretty close if the present government gives the same support that this government that I didn't support very much, but the last government did. They were supporting it. So, so the U.S. part was sort of supported by the Trump administration for whatever their reasons were. There's a lot of reasons for the U.S. to have various ways to, besides military, to put people in, to put resources in Japan and Japan here and so forth. So there's kind of a very high level trading that's done, and this fits into that as part of the U.S. contribution. So
now for the public, okay, they're going to say, okay, great. Now why? Big deal. What do you want to? What do you want to just build another big one for?
Why? I would say you don't, if you knew everything, you wouldn't build machines.
Yeah, of course.
But I would say the simplest way is the following. The biggest and most important discovery made in particle physics in the last 20 years or so is the discovery of the Higgs boson. For a reason that I said earlier, it's very hard to pursue that because the Higgs boson is only a 1% effect on top of the background in the CERN machine, the LHC. So no matter how much they pursue it, it's basically dominated by background. We barely can show that the Higgs has spin 0, which is what's expected, let alone anything else. Are there any partners? Does it behave? How does it behave? It is the one particle that's different than everything else in, let's say, describing Einstein's E equals mc squared. How do we create mass out of energy? And so this is a tremendously important concept. We presently don't understand it beyond the fact that we appear to be on the right track, and that Mr. Higgs and people who had that idea 50 years ago, and the particular idea that there's a particle associated with this seems to be right. But it's really hard to pursue. And that's as much because of the tools we have as it being a hard problem. If you pursued the Higgs boson and wanted to pursue it in detail, you need a machine that can see it cleanly and can concentrate on it, whether it's seeing all its decay modes, whether there's a partner, whether seeing important features like its self-coupling and so forth is features of the Higgs boson. So to me, just going up and higher in energy in particle physics is, you don't know that you're going to see anything beyond, but we already have a great discovery and we're not able with the present devices to pursue it. So I think the original motive, my own feeling is that the original motivation to build something which is basically a Higgs factory, something to really study the Higgs, is a really good way to go for the future of particle physics.
It's also, and it also, as you pointed out, and it has been the case, not uniquely, but in a number of cases, if you're looking for new particles, because electrons, positrons are so clean, it's easier to see new particles above the background rather than protons, which are made of lots of stuff, and the collisions are more complicated. And so that's certainly a factor in terms of the discovery factor of things you don't know, the known unknowns versus
discovering things depending on what energy and path, whether it's another Higgs, whether there's anything beyond the standard model, or even understanding our heaviest quark. So we know we can barely see and prove that it's there, the top quark, which is so heavy. But to pursue it, you need, again, to measure all the couplings and everything about the heaviest quark that we have. The best tool would be an E plus E minus machine. And so I think it may not be as much a discovery machine or oriented as a discovery machine is pursuing some things that we know, and we might also have discoveries, but going to higher energy doesn't look like necessarily the next factor of 2 or even decade in energy is where you're going to break through. And
well, we know, I mean, it's important to mention for people that the big, people say big deal, new particles or whatever, but we know this standard model, which is the fundamental model that describes the universe, isn't complete. We know it's not complete. We don't know where we're going to get the fundamental understanding that drives us to maybe not to solve that problem, but at least know what the right direction is. And without experiment, we'll never know, because theorists will just keep hallucinating and inventing wilder and wilder things, most of which are wrong. And I guess the other thing I would say is that, well, I've always said is that if you have the resources, and $10 billion for the whole world is, I would argue, is doable. But every time we've been fortunate that every time we've opened a new window in nature, whether it's the cosmic wave background or LIGO or whatever, you're surprised. Nature continues to surprise us, and unless we keep looking, as I say, you can't just do it in a room with a piece of paper, because whatever you come up with is not going to be what nature did. Generally, as a theorist, I can say that for sure. We need to keep looking, as you said earlier, and actually, I recently was talking to David Gross, and he agreed. I mean, we have to emphasize that physics is an experimental science. The theorists get all the, it sounds sexier, but science is experimental, and if the experiments aren't there, then the science just ends. And I think we either, and let me. I remember vividly when I was at Harvard, and our good friend Shelley Glashow was there arguing to go, to actually to build a machine that was eventually discovered W and Z. I remember, but I think it was, and he said, I remember him saying, "Do you want to walk or do you want to fly?" And
just Shelley.
Yes, Shelley. And so well, we don't know. You're right. In order to figure out where the issues are, the standard model, the one messenger is the Higgs, the one least understood part, and it's the thing that's worth studying. And I think as a civilization, if we stop asking those questions, it says something about us. But to do it, you need people who are willing to take risks, do new things, be bold, but be realistic. And that's why I have enjoyed so much our discussion, because you are the perfect example of that in so many cases. And I think for the people who've been listening to this who aren't physicists, I hope that's one of the things they're going to get out of this, what it takes. And I'm just so thankful to you to have spent the time and that patience to have worked through it with me. I've enjoyed it tremendously.
I did too.
I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. You can continue the discussion with us on social media and gain access to exclusive bonus content by supporting us through Patreon. This podcast is produced by the Origins Project Foundation, a non-profit organization whose goal is to enrich your perspective of your place in the cosmos by providing access to the people who are driving the future of society in the 21st century, and to the ideas that are changing our understanding of ourselves and our world. To learn more, please visit originsprojectfoundation.org.